Hello there, and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom as the evening deepens? A cozy corner where the weight of the day is finally lifting? Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight we're going to explore something that affects every single one of us, every single day, yet remains almost invisible. We're going to talk about how your money is quietly dying, slowly losing its power, slipping away so gradually you might not even notice. But don't worry. This isn't going to be a frantic warning or an alarming call to action. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the story of inflation, understanding what it is, why it happens, and what it means for all of us. By the end, I think you'll find that understanding this invisible force brings not anxiety, but a kind of calm clarity. If you drift away during our conversation, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let the words wash over you. Let yourself float. There's nowhere you need to be. Let's begin. Think about a cup of coffee, just an ordinary cup of coffee from your local cafe. If you're old enough to remember, or if you've heard stories from parents or grandparents, you might recall when that same cup of coffee cost $1, maybe less. Today that same cup, same size, same beans, same ceramic mug might cost you $5, or $6, or more, depending on where you live. What happened? Did coffee suddenly become more valuable? Did the beans grow scarce? Did the cafe owners become greedy? The answer is both simpler and more complex than any of those explanations. What happened is that your dollar died a little. It lost some of its power. The coffee stayed roughly the same. The dollar changed. This is inflation, though we rarely think about it in such stark terms. We say prices went up, and that's true enough. But there's another way to look at it, a way that reveals something profound about the nature of money itself. The price didn't really go up. Your money went down. The dollar in your pocket today cannot do what the dollar in your pocket could do 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 50 years ago. It has weakened. It has, in a very real sense, died a little. Let's sit with that idea for a moment. Every day, quietly, invisibly, the money you have is becoming less powerful, not because anyone is stealing it from you. Not because you're spending it. Simply because time passes and the nature of money is to erode. Like a sandcastle slowly worn down by waves, like a photograph gradually fading in sunlight, your purchasing power diminishes. This might sound alarming, but I want you to breathe. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Because here's what's important to understand. This process is normal. It's been happening for as long as money has existed. It's happening right now all around the world, and it will continue happening tomorrow. Understanding it doesn't mean you need to panic. Understanding it means you can navigate it with wisdom and calm. Think about your grandmother if you knew her. Think about the stories she might have told about prices when she was young. A candy bar for a nickel, a gallon of gas for 25 cents, a house for $15,000. These aren't fairy tales or exaggerations. These are economic realities from not so very long ago. And here's what's remarkable. Your grandmother, when she was young, probably heard similar stories from her grandmother. Quote 1. The song is ancient. The melody never changes. What changed wasn't the fundamental value of candy bars or gasoline or houses. What changed was the dollar. Over decades, slowly and relentlessly, the dollar lost purchasing power. Each year, it could buy a little less. Each decade, the erosion became more visible. Your grandmother's nickel had real buying power. Your nickel, if you can even find one, can't buy much of anything. This is what we mean when we talk about purchasing power. It's not about how many dollars you have. It's about what those dollars can actually do for you. You might have more dollars than your grandmother ever had. Your salary might be 10 times what your grandfather earned. But when you account for what those dollars can actually purchase, the gap might not be as wide as you think. He could buy a house on a single income. You might struggle to do the same on 2 incomes. The numbers got bigger. The purchasing power didn't necessarily follow. Let me give you another example, something more recent, more within your own memory. Think back to your first job, whenever that was. What did you earn per hour? $5? $7? $10? Now think about what you could buy with that hourly wage. A few gallons of gas. Maybe a cheap meal, some groceries. Now think about what that same $5 or $7 or $10 can buy today. Less gas, a cheaper meal, fewer groceries. The number stayed the same. The value changed. This is the strange magic trick of inflation. The numbers on the price tags go up, but we keep using the same word, dollar, as if it means the same thing it always meant. $1 in 1950 and $1 in 2025 are both called dollars. But they're not really the same thing at all. One can buy you a movie ticket and popcorn and a soda. The other might not even cover the ticket. Same name, different creature entirely. Economists have a way of expressing this. They talk about nominal values versus real values. The nominal value is the number on the price tag, the figure written on the paycheck. The real value is what that number can actually do, adjusted for the erosion of purchasing power. Your grandfather might have earned $5,000 a year. That's the nominal value. But in terms of what $5,000 could buy in 1950, a house, a car, food for a family, clothes, entertainment, the real value was substantial. Today, $5,000 is barely rent for a few months in many cities. Same nominal number, vastly different real value. This distinction between nominal and real is crucial, and we'll return to it again and again as we explore inflation together. Because inflation works by confusing these two things. It makes us think in nominal terms, numbers on paper, while it quietly erodes real terms, actual purchasing power. It's like a thief that doesn't take your money but makes each dollar worth less. So gradually you barely notice until you look back and realize how much has changed. And here's something else to understand, something that might bring you comfort. You're not imagining this. When you feel like things cost more than they used to, you're right. When you sense that your paycheck doesn't stretch as far, you're right. When you wonder how your parents bought a house at 30 and you can't at 40, you're perceiving a real phenomenon. It's not that you're bad with money or that you're not trying hard enough. It's that the invisible force of inflation has been at work, changing the game while keeping the same scoreboard. The purchasing power of $1 today, in 2025, is roughly 7% of what it was in 1913. Let that settle in your mind. If you had $100 in 1913 and you somehow preserved those exact bills, keeping them safe in a drawer for over a century, and then you took them out today to spend them, they would buy you what $7 would have bought you back then. 93% of the value simply gone, evaporated. Not because those bills burned or were stolen, but because time passed and the dollar died slowly, steadily, year after year. This is the invisible death we're talking about. It's not dramatic. There's no moment of collapse, no sudden loss, just erosion, like waves on a shore, like rust on iron, like the slow fade of an old newspaper left in the sun. Persistent, patient, inevitable. But again, breathe, let your shoulders drop. Because this erosion is not a crisis, it's a condition. It's the environment in which we all operate. Just as we all live with gravity pulling us toward the earth, we all live with inflation pulling value away from our stored money. Understanding gravity doesn't mean we panic about falling. It means we learn to walk, to build, to navigate the world as it actually is. Understanding inflation is the same. What we're going to do together tonight is understand this force. We're going to see where it comes from, how it works, who it helps and who it hurts, how we measure it, how we fight it, and how we live with it. We're going to trace its history across centuries and across continents. We're going to meet the people who've struggled with it and the people who've tried to control it. And by the end, you'll have a framework for understanding why that coffee costs what it costs, why your grandparents' stories sound like fantasy, and why your money is dying every day. If you enjoy these calm explorations of economic forces that shape our lives, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to understand the world. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of thoughtful listeners. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and let's explore together this invisible force that touches every transaction, every price tag, every paycheck, every savings account. There's no test at the end, no deadline to meet, just understanding offered gently, for you to take or leave as you drift towards sleep. Let's continue. Now that we've touched on the basic idea that purchasing power erodes, that dollars die slowly, let's go deeper. Let's understand what inflation actually is, how it manifests, and why it happens in the first place. Because inflation isn't just one thing. It's a family of related phenomena, each with its own character, its own causes, its own consequences. The simplest definition of inflation is this: a general increase in prices and fall in the purchasing value of money. Notice both parts of that definition. Prices increase, yes, but more fundamentally, money's purchasing value falls. These are two sides of the same coin, two ways of describing the same reality. You can say bread costs more, or you can say your dollar buys less bread. Both are true, both are inflation, but why does this happen? What force in the universe says that money must lose value over time? The answer isn't simple and it isn't singular. Inflation has many parents, many causes, many mechanisms. Let's explore them gently, one at a time, building understanding slowly. The first and perhaps most intuitive cause is simply too much money chasing too few goods. Imagine a small island economy, isolated and simple. There are 100 people on this island, and they have $100 circulating among them. There are also 100 loaves of bread available each week. The price settles at about $1 per loaf. Supply meets demand. Everything balances. Now imagine that somehow, and overnight, everyone on the island receives an additional $100. Maybe it washes ashore in a chest. Maybe a generous visitor gives it to them. The source doesn't matter. What matters is that now there are $200 circulating, but still only 100 loaves of bread each week. What happens to the price? At first, maybe nothing. People have more money and they're delighted. They go to buy bread at the old price of $1. But quickly, the bakers notice something. People have more money to spend. They're willing to pay more. And there's still only 100 loaves. If the baker keeps selling at $1, the bread sells out instantly and people who came late get nothing. So the baker raises the price to $2. Now supply and demand balance again. The 100 loaves sell to the people willing and able to pay $2 each. What happened? Did the bread change? Did it become more valuable, more nutritious, more delicious? No. The bread is identical. What changed was the amount of money relative to the amount of goods. More money, same goods, higher prices. This is demand pull inflation in its purest form. Demand pulls prices upward because there's more money available to spend, but not more stuff to buy. This pattern has played out throughout history, sometimes with devastating results. When Spanish conquistadors brought massive amounts of gold and silver back from the Americas in the 16th century, Europe experienced significant inflation. The amount of precious metal, which was money in that era, increased dramatically. The amount of goods available didn't increase nearly as much. Prices rose. The purchasing power of gold and silver fell. Spanish treasure, rather than making Europe wealthy, made Europe more expensive. The same dynamic appeared during wartime, again and again. Governments fighting wars need to spend enormous amounts of money, far more than they collect in taxes, so they print money or borrow it into existence. Soldiers get paid. Weapons manufacturers get paid. Suppliers get paid. Money floods the economy. But during war, fewer consumer goods are produced. Factories are making tanks instead of cars, bullets instead of tools. More money chasing fewer goods. prices rise, inflation accelerates. You might remember stories from World War II about rationing, about long lines, about shortages. That was partly logistics and partly deliberate policy, but it was also inflation trying to happen. The government was pumping money into the war effort. If that money had been allowed to chase the limited consumer goods available, prices would have skyrocketed. Rationing and price controls tried to suppress that pressure, with mixed success. When the war ended and factories converted back to consumer production, pent-up demand met increased supply. And the post-war economy had to navigate the inflationary pressures that had built up. Let that image rest in your mind for a moment. Too much money chasing too few goods. It's a simple concept, but a powerful one, and it explains much of the inflation we see in the world. But there's another kind of inflation, one that comes from a different direction. Instead of demand pulling prices up, costs push prices up. This is called, quite logically, cost-push inflation. Imagine you're a baker again. You've been selling bread at $2 per loaf, and that price covers your costs: flour, yeast, salt, labour, rent for your bakery, fuel for your ovens, with a reasonable profit left over. Then, suddenly, the price of flour doubles. It's not your fault. Maybe there was a drought that damaged the wheat harvest. Maybe transportation cost increased. Maybe a war disrupted supply chains. The reason doesn't change your reality. Flour now costs twice what it did, and flour is your primary input. What are your options? You could absorb the cost, accepting lower profit or even losses. But you can't do that indefinitely. You have bills to pay, a family to feed. So you do what you must. You raise the price of bread. Not because demand increased, not because you got greedy, but because your costs increased, and you're simply passing those increases along to maintain your business. Now multiply this across an entire economy. If the price of oil increases, and oil is an input for almost everything, from transportation to plastics to electricity generation, then the cost of nearly everything increases. Manufacturers pay more to run their factories and transport their goods. They raise prices. Retailers pay more for inventory and shipping. They raise prices. Consumers pay more for everything. The purchasing power of their money falls. Inflation occurs, pushed by rising costs rather than pulled by rising demand. The oil shocks of the 1970s demonstrated this mechanism dramatically. In 1973, Arab members of OPEC imposed an oil embargo on nations supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War, including the United States. The price of oil quadrupled almost overnight. Suddenly gasoline was expensive. Heating oil was expensive. Anything that required energy to produce or transport became more expensive. Inflation, which had been moderate, accelerated dramatically. People remember the 70s for long lines at gas stations, for odd-even rationing based on license plate numbers, for _quote_2_ buttons that accomplished nothing. But underneath the visible drama was this simple mechanism. A crucial input, energy, became much more expensive, and those costs rippled through the entire economy, pushing up prices across the board. The same thing happened again in the 2020s. In the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, supply chains, which had functioned invisibly and efficiently for decades, suddenly broke down. Factories in Asia shut down. Shipping containers ended up in the wrong places. Ports couldn't unload ships fast enough. The cost of shipping a container from Asia to North America increased by 5 or 10 times what it had been. Computer chips became scarce. Lumber prices spiked. Manufacturers couldn't get the inputs they needed or had to pay far more for them. They raised prices. Retailers faced higher wholesale costs and raised their prices. Consumers went to the store and found that everything from furniture to electronics to groceries cost noticeably more than it had the previous year. This was cost-push inflation, driven by supply disruptions and increased costs, not by excess demand or too much money. There's a third type of inflation, subtler but important. It's called built-in inflation, or sometimes wage price spiral inflation. This one feeds on itself, creating a cycle that can be difficult to break. Here's how it works. When prices rise, whether from demand pull or cost push or any other cause, workers notice their purchasing power declining. The same paycheck buys less than it did before, so workers, reasonably enough, demand higher wages to compensate. They want cost of living adjustments. They want raises that keep pace with inflation. Employers faced with these wage demands have a choice. They can refuse and risk losing workers or facing strikes, or they can grant the raises. Most, at least when labour is scarce and times are good, grant the raises. But now their labour costs have increased. Labour is a major cost for most businesses. So what do the employers do? They raise prices to cover their higher labour costs. Now prices are higher again. Workers notice again. They demand higher wages again. Employers raise prices again. Round and round it goes, wages and prices chasing each other upward in a spiral that can be hard to stop. Each side, workers and employers, is acting rationally from their own perspective. Workers need to maintain purchasing power. Employers need to maintain profitability. But the aggregate effect is sustained inflation, built into the system, feeding on itself. This dynamic was particularly visible in the United States in the late 1960s and through the 70s. Unemployment was low. Unions were strong. Workers had leverage to demand substantial wage increases. Employers granted them and raised prices. Inflation expectations became embedded in everyone's thinking. Workers expected prices to rise, so they demanded preemptive wage increases. Employers expected costs to rise, so they raised prices preemptively. The expectation of inflation helped create the inflation. Breaking this spiral required something dramatic, something painful. In the early 1980s, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to extraordinary levels. The prime rate reached over 20%, deliberately causing a recession to break the wage price spiral and reset inflation expectations. It worked, but at enormous cost. Unemployment rose above 10%. Businesses failed, families struggled. The medicine was harsh, but it ended the spiral. These three types, demand pull, cost push, and built in are the main mechanisms by which inflation occurs. But inflation isn't always moderate and manageable. Sometimes it escapes control entirely, becoming something monstrous. This is hyperinflation, and it's worth understanding because it shows what happens when the process runs wild. Hyperinflation is typically defined as inflation exceeding 50% per month. Think about that. Prices doubling every month. What cost 100 units of currency today costs 200 next month, 400 the month after, 800 the month after that. Within a year, prices have increased not by 50% or 100%, but by millions or billions of percent. Money becomes worthless almost as you watch. The classic example is Weimar Germany in the early 1920s. Germany, defeated in World War I, owed massive reparations to the victorious Allies. The government, unable to raise sufficient taxes and unwilling to default, simply printed money to pay its debts. The amount of currency in circulation increased exponentially. Prices followed. By 1923, the inflation was so severe that workers were paid twice a day and would rush out on their lunch breaks to spend their morning wages before they became worthless by evening. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1918 cost billions of marks by 1923. People carried money in wheelbarrows and baskets. Not because they were rich, but because it took that much currency to buy groceries. Stories circulated of people burning money in stoves because it was cheaper than buying firewood. The social and political consequences were catastrophic. Life savings became worthless overnight. Pensions that had been comfortable became insufficient to buy a single meal. The middle class was wiped out. Trust in government and in money itself collapsed. The trauma and chaos of hyperinflation created the conditions for political extremism. A decade later, the Nazis would rise to power, exploiting the bitterness and instability that hyperinflation had helped create. Zimbabwe experienced similar horror in the 2000s. The government of Robert Mugabe printed money recklessly to fund government spending and political patronage. Inflation accelerated from manageable levels to complete catastrophe. By 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation rate reached millions of percent per month. The government eventually printed a $100 trillion banknote, which couldn't buy a bus ticket. The currency became so worthless that people used it as wallpaper, literally more valuable for decoration than for purchasing. Eventually, Zimbabwe abandoned its own currency entirely and adopted the US dollar and other foreign currencies. Venezuela, in the 2010s, followed a similar path. A combination of economic mismanagement, political dysfunction, and collapse in oil revenues led to hyperinflation. By 2018, inflation was estimated at over 1 million% annually. Ordinary Venezuelans suffered terribly. Savings evaporated, salaries became meaningless, people scavenged for food, millions fled the country. The bolivar, once a stable currency, became worthless paper. These examples show inflation at its worst, when it escapes all control and destroys an economy and society. But take comfort. Hyperinflation is rare. It requires truly catastrophic government policy, usually a combination of printing massive amounts of money while productive capacity collapses. Most countries, most of the time, experience moderate inflation that, while persistent, is manageable. There's also the opposite of inflation, a phenomenon called deflation, and it has its own problems. Deflation means prices are falling and the purchasing power of money is increasing. This sounds wonderful. Who wouldn't want their money to become more valuable? But deflation can be economically destructive. Here's why. If prices are falling, people delay purchases. Why buy today when it will be cheaper next month? This is rational for individuals, but disastrous collectively. When everyone delays spending, businesses lose revenue. They cut production. They lay off workers. Unemployment rises. Those unemployed workers spend even less. Demand falls further. Prices fall more. The economy spirals downward. Deflation also makes debt more burdensome. If you borrowed $100,000 when prices were high, and then deflation occurs and prices fall, you still owe $100,000, but now that sum represents more real value. Your income, if you're fortunate enough to still have income, is falling in nominal terms. Paying back the debt becomes harder. Defaults increase. Banks fail. Credit contracts. The spiral continues. Japan has struggled with deflation and very low inflation for over 30 years, since their asset bubble burst in the early 1990s. Despite enormous government spending and unconventional monetary policy, Japan has had difficulty generating sustained inflation. Prices have been stagnant or falling. This sounds benign, but has contributed to economic stagnation, tepid growth, and a sense of malaise. Deflation, it turns out, is not a blessing but a curse. Between the extremes of hyperinflation and deflation lies moderate inflation, and this is where most developed economies try to remain. Central banks in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere typically target around 2% inflation per year. This might seem arbitrary, but there are reasons. 2% is low enough that people don't worry constantly about rising prices. It doesn't distort economic decisions too much. Savings don't erode so fast that saving becomes pointless. But 2% is also high enough to provide a buffer against deflation. It gives central banks room to cut interest rates when needed without falling into deflation. It allows for gradual adjustments in relative prices, some things getting more expensive, others less, without requiring nominal price cuts, which people resist psychologically. Think of it as the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold. Not hyperinflation, not deflation, but a moderate, predictable erosion of purchasing power that the economy can digest and adapt to. Your money still dies slowly at 2% annual inflation, but slowly enough that you can plan for it, account for it, live with it. Over a lifetime, even 2% adds up. In 30 years at 2% annual inflation, prices roughly double. What costs $100 today will cost about $180 in 30 years. Your savings, if they earn no return, will buy only about half what they buy today. This is not trivial, but it's predictable and manageable, unlike the chaos of hyperinflation or the stagnation of deflation. So when we talk about inflation, we're usually talking about this moderate, chronic inflation, not the dramatic disasters, but the everyday erosion, the slow death of purchasing power that requires us to think carefully about how we save, invest, and plan for the future. Let your mind rest with these ideas for a moment. Inflation has many faces. It can be pulled by demand or pushed by costs. It can spiral through wage price dynamics. It can explode into hyperinflation or reverse into deflation. Most commonly, it settles into a moderate, persistent erosion that central banks try to manage and that we all navigate as best we can. This is the landscape we're exploring, not a single monster, but a whole ecosystem of related phenomena. And understanding this ecosystem is the first step toward navigating it wisely, calmly, without panic, but with clear eyes. If you're drifting now, that's perfectly fine. Let yourself float. The words will continue, and you can take them or leave them as you slip towards sleep. There's no hurry. There's nowhere else to be. Just rest and let understanding come gently, in its own time. We've explored what inflation is in its essence, the slow death of purchasing power, the erosion that happens when prices rise and money's value falls. We've seen the different forces that can create inflation, demand pulling prices up, costs pushing them up, wages and prices chasing each other in spirals. We've glimpsed the extremes, the hyperinflations that destroy currencies and the deflations that strangle economies. Now let's deepen our understanding by looking at how economists and statisticians try to measure this invisible force, because measuring something you can't see, something that affects millions of prices across an entire economy, is remarkably complex. Take a breath. Let your mind settle. We're going to explore the machinery of measurement, the systems that try to capture inflation's reality in numbers and indices. This might sound technical, but we'll move through it slowly, gently, making it tangible and understandable. The challenge is this: inflation isn't a single price changing. It's the general level of all prices changing, but all prices is an impossibly large concept. There are millions of goods and services in a modern economy, each with its own price, and those prices are changing constantly for individual reasons that have nothing to do with inflation. Tomatoes get expensive in winter and cheap in summer. New technology starts expensive and becomes cheaper as production scales. Fashion items have their own cycles of desirability and price. So how do you separate inflation, the general rise in price levels, from these individual price movements? How do you measure the average when the average includes everything from haircuts to houses, from apples to automobiles, from electricity to entertainment? The solution that most countries have settled on is something called the Consumer Price Index, usually abbreviated as CPI. Let's understand how it works by building it from the ground up, piece by piece. Imagine you're a government statistician tasked with measuring inflation. You need to figure out how much more expensive life has become for ordinary people. The first question you face is, what does an ordinary person buy? What basket of goods and services represents typical consumption? To answer this, statistical agencies conduct detailed surveys. In the United States, the Bureau of Labor Statistics sends researchers to thousands of households across the country. These researchers ask detailed questions about what people buy. How much do you spend on housing? On food, on transportation, on healthcare, on clothing, on entertainment. They collect data from tens of thousands of households, building a comprehensive picture of how the average American spends money. From this data, they construct what's called the basket of goods. Think of it as a metaphorical shopping cart that represents typical purchases. The basket includes rent or mortgage payments, electricity and gas bills, groceries of various kinds, gasoline, car payments, insurance, doctor visits, prescription medications, clothing, shoes, furniture, appliances, restaurant meals, movie tickets, haircuts, and hundreds of other items. Each item is included in proportion to how much of the average household's budget it consumes. Housing, for instance, represents about 1/3 of the typical household budget, so it gets a weight of roughly 33% in the index. Food might be another 13 or 14%. Transportation another 15 or 16%. Healthcare, clothing, education, recreation. Each gets weighted according to its share of typical spending. Once this basket is constructed, the statisticians then track the prices of all these items month after month, year after year. They don't just check one grocery store or one gas station. They gather price data from thousands of retail locations across the country, trying to capture the actual prices that real people pay in different regions and different types of stores. Let's say the basket, with all its weighted items, cost $10,000 in the base year, the year they've chosen as the starting point for comparison. Then, a year later, they check all the prices again. Maybe that same basket now costs $10,200. The prices of the same goods and services have increased by $200, or 2%. That's your inflation rate, 2%. This sounds straightforward, but there are complexities and complications at every step, decisions that affect what the index captures and what it misses. Let's explore some of these because they matter for understanding what inflation statistics actually mean. First, there's the issue of substitution. People don't actually buy a fixed basket. When prices change, people adjust their behaviour. If beef becomes expensive, they buy more chicken. If oranges are costly, they buy more apples. If gasoline prices spike, they drive less or buy more fuel-efficient cars. The fixed basket approach doesn't capture this substitution. It assumes you keep buying the same beef even when it's expensive, which overstates the impact of that price increase on your actual cost of living. To address this, statisticians periodically update the basket to reflect changing consumption patterns, and they've developed more sophisticated indices that allow for some substitution. But this creates its own controversy. Critics argue that allowing substitution understates inflation because it essentially says, "You're not worse off, you just eat chicken instead of beef now," which feels wrong to someone who actually wanted beef but can no longer afford it. Second, there's the problem of quality changes. The car you buy today is not the same as the car from 20 years ago, even if it's the same model name. Today's car has airbags, anti-lock brakes, backup cameras, better fuel efficiency, Bluetooth connectivity, more reliable engineering. It's objectively better. So if the nominal price has increased but the quality has also increased, is that really inflation? Or are you paying more but getting more? Statisticians make what are called hedonic adjustments, trying to separate price increases due to inflation from price increases due to quality improvements. If a new computer costs $1,000 but is twice as powerful as last year's $1,000 computer, they might treat this as a price decrease in real terms. You're getting more computing power per dollar, even though the dollar price stayed the same. This sounds reasonable in theory, but can feel frustrating to consumers. You're told inflation is low, but the computer you want to buy still costs $1,000, and the fact that it's more powerful than last year's model doesn't help if you can't afford it. The statistics say you're getting more for your money. Your bank account says you're still spending $1,000. Third, there's the challenge of new products. The basket is based on what people bought in the past, but new products enter the market constantly. Smartphones didn't exist 30 years ago. Now they're essential. Streaming services didn't exist 20 years ago. Now many households consider them necessary. When and how do these get added to the basket? If they're added too late, the index misses the impact of these new forms of spending. If they're added too quickly, it might not reflect stable patterns. Fourth, Different people experience different inflation rates. The CPI measures the average, but averages hide enormous variation. If you're a retiree, you spend a much larger share of your budget on healthcare than a young worker does. If healthcare costs rise faster than other prices, you experience higher inflation than the average. If you're a young family, you spend a lot on childcare and education. If those costs rise rapidly, your personal inflation is higher than someone without children. If you live in a city with rapidly rising housing costs, your inflation experience is completely different from someone in a rural area where housing is stable or even declining. The national CPI gives you a number, say 3%, but that might mean nothing to your actual situation. You might be experiencing 6% inflation, while your cousin in another state experiences 1%. Economists are aware of these limitations. They've developed multiple measures to try to capture different aspects of inflation. There's the headline CPI, which includes everything. There's core CPI, which excludes food and energy, because those prices are volatile and can swing wildly due to weather, geopolitics, and other factors that don't reflect underlying inflation trends. There's the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, or PCE, which uses a different methodology and is actually the Federal Reserve's preferred measure. There's the Producer Price Index, or PPI, which measures inflation at the wholesale level before it reaches consumers. Each of these indices tells a slightly different story. They move together over time, they're all measuring the same underlying phenomenon, but they can diverge in the short term. In a given month, CPI might show 3% inflation, while PCE shows 2.5%. Neither is wrong, exactly. They're measuring different things in different ways. This can be confusing and can fuel distrust in official statistics. Let's pause and picture what this measurement process actually looks like on the ground. Imagine the workers who collect this data. Every month, thousands of them fan out across the country. They visit grocery stores, noting the price of milk, bread, eggs, coffee, produce. They visit gas stations, recording fuel prices. They check rents by surveying landlords and tenants. They call utilities to get electricity and gas rates. They visit car dealerships, clothing stores, electronics retailers. They attend medical clinics, checking the cost of doctor visits and procedures. This is meticulous, unglamorous work. Each price they record is a single data point, and it takes millions of these data points to construct the index. The workers note not just the price, but the specific product, brand, size, features. They come back month after month to the same stores, tracking the same items, building the time series that allows comparison. All this data flows into massive databases. Statisticians clean it, check for errors, apply weights, make adjustments, run calculations. Complex algorithms account for seasonal variations. Ice cream prices peak in summer, heating oil in winter. Quality adjustments are applied based on expert assessment and regression analysis. The basket weights are updated periodically to reflect changing consumption patterns revealed by new surveys. Finally, a number emerges. The Consumer Price Index for the month is announced. This single number, something like 300 or 310, is the distillation of millions of price observations and thousands of hours of work. The change from last month's number, expressed as a percentage, is the inflation rate. This is what gets reported in the news. This is what central banks react to. This is what shapes policy and perception. But remember, this is all an approximation, an attempt to quantify something that's inherently complex and multidimensional. The CPI is not the truth about inflation. It's a model, a representation, a useful tool that captures important aspects of reality while necessarily simplifying and abstracting. This matters because people often have a sense that official inflation statistics don't match their lived experience. You hear the government announce inflation is 2%, but when you go to the grocery store or pay your rent or look at healthcare bills, it feels like prices are rising much faster than 2%. Are you imagining it? Are the statistics lying? Usually. Neither. The statistics are accurately measuring what they're designed to measure, the average price change of a weighted basket of goods across the entire country. But your experience is specific to you, to your location, to your particular consumption patterns, to your stage of life. If the things you buy happen to be inflating faster than average, your personal inflation rate is higher than the official rate. Both numbers are real. They're just measuring different things. There's also a psychological dimension. Price increases are salient and memorable. Price decreases or stable prices are barely noticed. You remember that your favourite cereal now costs 50 cents more than it used to. You probably don't remember or notice that your television cost half as much as a comparable television would have cost 10 years ago. The increases stick in memory. The decreases fade. This creates a perception bias where inflation feels worse than it statistically is. Economists call this, quote, 5 or, quote, 6. We have a hard time thinking in real terms. We think in nominal terms, the numbers on price tags and paychecks. When your salary increases by 3% and inflation is 3%, you're no better off in real terms. Your purchasing power hasn't changed. But it feels like you got a raise, like you're doing better, because the nominal number went up. Conversely, if prices rise by 3% and your salary doesn't change, you feel poor, even though the real change is the same as the previous example. Just the nominal framing is different. This psychological difficulty with distinguishing nominal from real is part of why inflation is so socially and politically fraught. People feel poorer when prices rise, even if their incomes rise equally. The nominal price increase is visible and painful. The corresponding nominal income increase doesn't provide the same psychological satisfaction. This creates political pressure on governments to do something about inflation, even when the inflation is moderate and being offset by wage increases. Let's consider another complexity in measurement. What counts as a price increase versus a new product? When streaming services replaced cable television, was that inflation or transformation? Cable bills were $60 or $70 a month. Now people might pay $15 for Netflix, $15 for Disney+, $12 for HBO Max. That's over $40. Less than cable, but still substantial. Is that deflation because you're paying less for video entertainment, or is it incomparable because the products are different? Housing presents similar challenges. The CPI tracks rent and something called quote 8, which tries to measure the consumption value of owned housing. But what about home prices themselves? If you're trying to buy a house, the fact that the CPI shows moderate inflation is cold comfort when home prices in your city have doubled in 5 years. The CPI doesn't directly measure asset prices, house prices, stock prices, the price of land, because these are considered investments, not consumption. But this distinction feels arbitrary when you need a place to live and houses have become unaffordable. The same applies to education. Tuition at many universities has increased far faster than general inflation for decades. If you have children approaching college age, this matters enormously. But education is a relatively small part of the overall CPI basket, so even rapid tuition increases don't move the overall index much. The national inflation rate can be 2% while your personal experience, dominated by tuition bills, is 10% inflation. Healthcare is another area where official statistics and lived experience can diverge dramatically. Healthcare costs have generally risen faster than overall inflation for decades. Medical care is about 9% of the CPI basket, weighted according to average spending. But for someone with chronic illness, or someone uninsured or underinsured, or an elderly person on a fixed income, healthcare might be 20 or 30% of spending. For them, rapid healthcare inflation creates real hardship that the average inflation number doesn't capture. This doesn't mean the CPI is useless or deliberately misleading. It means it's an average, and averages by definition obscure individual variation. The CPI tells you something true and important about the overall economy. It doesn't necessarily tell you something true about your personal situation. Both facts can coexist. Governments and central banks use these indices to make crucial decisions. Social Security benefits in the United States are adjusted annually based on CPI increases, a cost of living adjustment meant to preserve retirees' purchasing power. If the CPI says inflation was 3%, Social Security payments increase by 3% the next year. This matters enormously to the tens of millions of people who rely on Social Security. Tax brackets are also adjusted based on inflation measures, preventing what's called bracket creep, the phenomenon where inflation pushes you into higher tax brackets, even though your real income hasn't increased. Without these adjustments, inflation would be a hidden tax increase. By indexing brackets to inflation, the tax code tries to maintain consistent real taxation. Contracts often include inflation adjustments. Labour union contracts might specify that wages increase by the CPI rate. Commercial leases might include escalation clauses tied to inflation. Treasury Inflation-Protected Securities, which we'll discuss more later, pay interest that adjusts with CPI. The index becomes woven into the fabric of economic life. This creates pressure to get the index right, but also creates political incentives to manipulate it. If the government can show lower inflation, it can give smaller Social Security increases, saving money. If unions can argue that official inflation understates reality, they can justify larger wage demands. The technical decisions about methodology, about substitution, and hedonic adjustments and weighting carry enormous financial implications. Billions of dollars turn on decimal points in the inflation rate. Statisticians try to remain objective, following methodological principles and international standards. But they're human, working within bureaucracies, subject to political and budgetary pressures. The integrity of inflation statistics matters, and most developed countries maintain that integrity. But the temptation to manipulate is always present, especially in countries with weaker institutions. When governments want to hide inflation, they change how they measure it, exclude inconvenient items, simply stop reporting certain data. Argentina in the 2010s famously manipulated its inflation statistics, reporting rates far below what independent economists and ordinary citizens knew to be true. Even in countries with trustworthy statistics, there's healthy debate about methodology. Should the basket be updated annually or less frequently? How aggressive should hedonic adjustments be? Should housing be measured differently? Should asset prices be included? These aren't questions with obvious right answers. They involve trade-offs between different goods, accuracy versus consistency, timeliness versus reliability, simplicity versus sophistication. Let your mind rest with this understanding. Measuring inflation is hard. It requires millions of observations, complex calculations, methodological decisions that affect outcomes. The resulting indices are imperfect but useful, giving us a window into the invisible process of currency erosion. They don't tell us everything, and they don't capture everyone's experience equally, but they tell us enough to navigate, to plan, to make policy. When you hear that inflation is 3% or 5% or whatever the current number is, you now know what that means and what it doesn't mean. It means the average price of a weighted basket of goods has changed by that amount. It means the purchasing power of currency has eroded by roughly that amount. It doesn't mean your personal experience matches that average. It doesn't mean every price changed by that amount. It doesn't mean the measurement is perfect or beyond debate. This knowledge doesn't solve anything by itself, but it provides context. It lets you interpret the numbers you hear with more sophistication. It helps you understand why your grocery bills might feel like they're rising faster than official inflation suggests, because they might be for you, even if the average is different. It helps you see that inflation measurement is a human endeavour, imperfect but earnest, trying to quantify something essential but elusive. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. We've been through complex territory, through the machinery of measurement, through baskets and indices and adjustments. Let it settle in your mind like sediment in water, slowly arranging itself into patterns you can return to later if you choose. There's no urgency, no test, just understanding offered gently, for you to hold lightly or release as you move towards sleep. Rest now. Breathe slowly. The invisible force of inflation continues whether we measure it precisely or not, whether we understand it fully or partially. But now you understand more than you did before, and that understanding is a kind of calm power, a foundation for navigating the economic world with less confusion and more clarity. Let that be enough. Let yourself be at peace. We've explored how statisticians try to measure inflation, how they construct baskets of goods and track prices across millions of transactions, trying to capture the invisible erosion of purchasing power in a single number. We've seen the challenges and compromises involved, the gap between average statistics and individual experience. Now let's step back in time and see how this invisible force has manifested throughout history, because inflation is not a modern invention. It's as old as money itself, and understanding its history helps us see patterns, helps us recognize that what feels unprecedented and alarming today has often happened before. Take a slow breath. Let your mind settle into the rhythm of centuries passing. We're going to move through time slowly, visiting moments when inflation surged or money collapsed, seeing how people responded, learning from their struggles and their adaptations. History has much to teach us if we listen patiently. Let's begin in ancient Rome, because even the mightiest empire the world had known couldn't escape the logic of currency debasement and inflation. Roman currency was based on precious metal, primarily silver and gold. The denarius, a silver coin, was the standard currency for centuries. In the early empire under Augustus around the time of Christ, a denarius contained about 95% pure silver. It was an honest coin, its value derived from the valuable metal it contained. But empires are expensive. Military campaigns, public works, bread and circuses to keep the population content, the vast bureaucracy needed to govern millions of people across 3 continents, all of this required money. And Roman emperors, facing financial pressure, discovered a tempting solution. They could reduce the silver content of the denarius while keeping it the same size and claiming it had the same value. Mix in cheaper metals, copper, bronze, and you can mint more coins from the same amount of silver. Emperor Nero began this process in the 1st century, reducing the silver content to about 90%. His successors continued the trend. Each emperor shaved a bit more silver from the coins, replacing it with base metal. By the time of Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century, the denarius was only about 75% silver. By the 3rd century, during the crisis of imperial succession and barbarian invasions, the denarius had become mostly copper, with just a silver wash on the surface, perhaps 5% actual silver. What happened? Prices rose. People noticed that coins weren't what they used to be. Merchants demanded more coins for the same goods, because each coin contained less valuable metal. The government minted more and more debased coins to meet its expenses, flooding the economy with currency that was worth less and less. This is inflation in its most literal form. The currency itself being inflated, puffed up with worthless metal while pretending to be valuable. The consequences were severe. The Roman economy, which had been sophisticated and prosperous, experienced prolonged inflation and instability. Trade suffered. People hoarded old coins with higher silver content and spent only the debased new coins, a pattern. Economists would later call Gresham's law. Bad money drives out good. The tax system broke down because taxes paid in worthless coins couldn't fund government operations. The empire's financial crisis contributed to its broader political and military crises. By the late 3rd century, Emperor Diocletian tried to stop inflation through brute force, issuing an edict that fixed maximum prices for thousands of goods and services. anyone charging more than the legal maximum could be executed. But price controls don't address the underlying problem of currency debasement. Merchants simply stopped selling at the official prices, creating shortages. Black markets flourished. The edict failed, and inflation continued. This Roman pattern, governments facing financial pressure, debasing currency to create more money, triggering inflation, then trying to control it through force rather than addressing root causes, would repeat throughout history. Let the image settle. Roman emperors in purple togas, making decisions that seemed necessary in the moment, slowly destroying the currency that had made their empire great. Let's move forward nearly a millennium to medieval Europe, where a different kind of inflation emerged from an unexpected source: discovery and conquest. In 1492, Columbus sailed across the Atlantic. In 1519, Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire. In 1533, Pizarro conquered the Incas. These conquests brought Spain access to vast quantities of gold and silver in Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia. The mines of Potosí in Bolivia were so rich that the phrase "worth a Potosí" entered European languages as a synonym for incredible wealth. Spanish galleons began carrying this precious metal back to Europe. At first, this seemed like pure blessing. Spain was becoming rich beyond imagination. But remember our island economy example from earlier. More money, same goods, higher prices. The amount of gold and silver in Europe increased dramatically through the 16th century. The amount of goods available to buy increased much more slowly. The result was what historians call the price revolution. Prices across Europe roughly tripled or quadrupled over the course of the 16th century. This doesn't sound dramatic by modern standards. We're used to prices changing that much in decades, not centuries. But for medieval people, accustomed to price stability across generations, this was shocking and destabilizing. A loaf of bread that had cost the same for 100 years was suddenly much more expensive. Wages, which were often fixed by tradition and custom, didn't keep up. Real incomes fell for workers and anyone on fixed incomes. Spain, ironically, suffered particularly badly. The treasure fleets brought wealth, but the wealth brought inflation that made Spanish goods expensive compared to other European countries. Spanish manufacturing declined because it couldn't compete. The silver and gold flowed through Spain and out to other European countries to pay for imports. Spain became dependent on its colonies while its domestic economy weakened. The very treasure that should have made Spain great instead contributed to its long decline. This historical episode teaches an important lesson. Wealth is not the same as money. Real wealth is productive capacity, goods and services, knowledge and skills. Money is just a medium of exchange. Increasing the money supply without increasing productive capacity doesn't make a society wealthier. It just makes prices higher. The Spanish learned this painfully. The treasure of the Americas couldn't buy prosperity if it simply bid up prices without creating productive investment. Let's move forward again to the American colonies in the 18th century, where another inflation story unfolded, one that would shape American attitudes toward paper currency for generations. The colonies in North America were chronically short of hard currency, gold and silver coins. They were exporting raw materials to Britain and importing manufactured goods, and the balance of trade meant that precious metal tended to flow back to Britain. To facilitate commerce, colonies began issuing their own paper currency, essentially IOUs backed by future tax revenue or land. At first, this worked reasonably well when issued in moderation, but the temptation to print more currency was strong. Governments facing expenses, building roads, funding militias, paying officials, found it easier to print money than to raise taxes. And for a while, it seemed to work. The currency circulated, commerce continued. But gradually, people lost confidence. The paper bills multiplied while the hard assets backing them didn't. Inflation followed. Different colonies experienced different severities. Some maintained reasonable discipline. others printed recklessly. Rhode Island's currency became so depreciated that contracts began specifying payment in currencies of other colonies or in silver. The phrase, quote, 10, would later emerge from an even worse currency crisis, but the colonial experience set the pattern. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress faced an impossible situation. They were trying to fund a war against the world's most powerful empire. They had no authority to tax. The states were unreliable in their contributions. So Congress printed money, lots of it, in the form of continental dollars. At first, patriotic fervour sustained the currency's value. People accepted continentals as payment because supporting the revolution seemed worth the risk. But as the war dragged on and the printing presses kept running, confidence evaporated. By 1780, it took 40 continental dollars to buy what $1 had bought in 1775. By 1781, the ratio was over 100 to 1. The continental had become nearly worthless, giving rise to that phrase. Quote 11. Soldiers were paid in continentals that couldn't buy food or supplies. Merchants refused to accept them. The revolution survived, but barely, and one of its legacies was a deep suspicion of paper money that would influence American monetary policy for the next century. The Constitution gave Congress the power to coin money but said nothing explicitly about printing paper money, a deliberate ambiguity born from revolutionary experience. This colonial and revolutionary inflation shaped American identity in subtle ways. The United States would be slower than other countries to adopt central banking, more suspicious of government-issued currency, more attached to hard money backed by precious metal. The trauma of continental dollars lasted for generations. Let's move forward to the 19th century, a period of tremendous economic expansion in America, but also periodic financial crises and currency debates that often centered on inflation. After the Civil War, the United States faced another inflation legacy. To fund the war, the government had printed paper money called greenbacks, not backed by gold. This created inflation during and after the war. Once peace came, a great political debate emerged. Should the greenbacks be retired and the country return to a gold standard, or should the paper money continue circulating? Creditors, banks, bondholders, anyone owed money, wanted to return to gold. Returning to gold would mean deflation as the money supply contracted. They would be repaid in more valuable currency than they'd lent out. Debtors, farmers, small businesses, anyone who owed money, wanted to keep the greenbacks and even expand the money supply. Inflation would let them repay debts with cheaper currency. The creditors won. The country returned to a gold standard. Deflation followed, exactly as predicted. Prices fell. Debtors struggled. This set up the great political battles of the late 19th century over free silver. Silver had traditionally been part of American coinage, but in 1873 Congress ended the free coinage of silver, effectively putting the country on a pure gold standard. This became hugely controversial. Farmers, who were typically in debt, saw the gold standard as a tool of Eastern bankers to keep them poor. Allowing free coinage of silver would expand the money supply, create moderate inflation, and make their debts easier to repay. The debate came to a head in the election of 1896. William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic candidate, gave his famous Cross of Gold speech declaring, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." He advocated for silver coinage to create inflation and help debtors. William McKinley, the Republican, defended the gold standard. McKinley won, and the gold standard remained. But notice what this debate reveals. Inflation was not just an economic phenomenon, but a political one, a struggle over who would benefit and who would suffer. There were no neutral positions, only different interests. The same would be true of every inflation debate that followed. Let the 19th century rest in your mind. Picture farmers in the Midwest, struggling with debts that deflation made heavier. Picture bankers in New York insisting on sound money backed by gold. Picture politicians giving speeches about silver and gold. knowing that millions of votes and billions of dollars rode on these technical-sounding debates. The stakes were always high, the choices always difficult. Now let's move to the 20th century, to the great inflation of the 1970s, perhaps the most important inflation episode in modern American history, because its lessons still shape policy today. The story begins in the 1960s. The economy was strong, unemployment was low, President Lyndon Johnson was pursuing ambitious social programs, the war on poverty, Medicare, Medicaid, while also fighting the Vietnam War. This combination, quote 15 as critics called it, meant huge government spending. The Federal Reserve, which controls monetary policy, faced a choice. It could restrict money supply to prevent inflation, but that might raise unemployment and slow the economy. Or it could accommodate the government spending by keeping money loose, accepting some inflation as the price of full employment. The Fed chose accommodation. At first, inflation was moderate, 3 or 4% annually. But inflation has a tendency to feed on itself, to accelerate. As prices rose, workers demanded higher wages to compensate. Employers granted the raises and passed the costs on through higher prices. Inflation expectations became embedded. People expected prices to rise, so they acted in ways that made prices rise, demanding preemptive wage increases, raising prices preemptively. The wage price spiral we discussed earlier took hold. Then came the oil shocks. In 1973, Arab oil producers embargoed exports to countries supporting Israel. Oil prices quadrupled. Energy costs rippled through the entire economy. This was cost-push inflation overlaying the demand pull and wage price inflation already present. The combination was devastating. By the mid-1970s, inflation was running at 7, 8, 9% annually, sometimes higher. The economy was also struggling with high unemployment, a combination that shouldn't have been possible according to prevailing economic theory. The Phillips curve suggested a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. You could have one or the other, but not both. Now, America had both, a situation economists labelled stagflation. President Gerald Ford launched a public relations campaign called Whip Inflation Now, with buttons bearing the acronym WIN. Citizens were encouraged to save more and spend less to reduce demand. It was ineffective. Inflation continued. President Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker as Federal Reserve Chairman in 1979. Volcker was convinced that inflation had to be broken, whatever the cost. He raised interest rates dramatically. The prime rate, the rate banks charged their best customers, rose above 20%. 20%. Mortgages became nearly impossible to obtain. Business lending dried up. The economy fell into a severe recession. Unemployment rose above 10%. The pain was intense and widespread. Farmers couldn't finance operations. Businesses failed. Workers lost jobs. There was enormous political pressure on Volcker to relent, to lower rates and ease the pain. He refused. He understood that breaking inflation required convincing everyone that the Fed would tolerate recession, that it wouldn't flinch, that inflation would not be tolerated regardless of the economic cost. By 1982, it worked. Inflation broke. The wage price spiral stopped. Inflation expectations reset. By the mid-1980s, inflation was back down to 3 or 4%. The recession ended and the economy began a long expansion. But the Volcker recession left scars. Communities that depended on manufacturing were devastated and never fully recovered. The Rust Belt was born from this period. Unions, which had been powerful, were weakened permanently. Workers learned that they couldn't count on ever-rising wages. The economic and political landscape had shifted. The lesson policymakers took from the 70s and 80s was that inflation, once established, is very hard to dislodge. Prevention is far easier than cure. Better to keep inflation low and stable from the beginning than to let it accelerate and then have to break it painfully. This lesson would shape monetary policy for the next 4 decades. Central banks became inflation hawks, are quick to raise rates at the first sign of sustained price increases. Let yourself rest with these historical images. Roman emperors debasing coins, Spanish galleons heavy with silver, continental soldiers paid in worthless paper, farmers demanding silver coinage, Paul Volcker accepting recession to break inflation. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. The patterns recur. The temptations are the same. The trade-offs remain difficult. Understanding this history gives perspective. When you hear about inflation today, when you see prices rising and wonder what it means and what will happen, you can look back at these episodes and see that others have navigated this before. Sometimes well, sometimes badly, always with difficulty. The inflation you're experiencing is part of a very old story, a story without a final chapter, because as long as money exists, inflation will exist as a possibility, a pressure, a challenge requiring vigilance and wisdom. If you're drifting now, that's perfectly fine. We've travelled across centuries, across continents, through Roman mints and Spanish treasure fleets and American political battles. Let it all settle like layers of sediment, building up slowly, creating a foundation of understanding. History is patient. It waits for us to learn from it, but it doesn't demand that we learn immediately. Take what you can. Let the rest rest. There's no hurry. There never is. Sleep now if sleep is calling you. The invisible force of inflation continues its work, but you understand it better now, see it in context, recognize it as part of the human story that's as old as money itself. That understanding is a gift you can carry forward, a calm knowledge that diminishes fear and increases wisdom. Let that be enough for now. Let yourself be at peace. We've journeyed through history, watching inflation unfold across centuries and civilizations, seeing how the erosion of currency is as ancient as money itself. We've seen emperors and presidents struggle with the same fundamental tensions, the same impossible choices. Now let's turn from history to examine something more personal, more immediate. Let's explore who inflation helps and who it hurts, because inflation is never neutral. It redistributes wealth and power, often in ways that aren't obvious, creating winners and losers in patterns that shape societies and fuel political battles. Take a breath, settle into your pillow. We're going to move through these dynamics slowly, examining how the same inflation that devastates some people can actually benefit others, not through malice or conspiracy, but through the simple mechanics of how money and debt and assets interact in an inflationary environment. Let's begin with perhaps the most important divide, the line between debtors and creditors, between those who owe money and those to whom money is owed. Imagine you borrowed $100,000 to buy a house. You signed a mortgage with a fixed interest rate. Your monthly payment is set, let's say at $1,000 per month. This is a nominal amount, a fixed number of dollars regardless of what those dollars can buy. Now imagine that significant inflation occurs, let's say 5% annually over a decade. During that decade, prices roughly double. Your salary, if it keeps pace with inflation, also roughly doubles. The $1,000 payment that seemed substantial when you took out the mortgage now feels much lighter, because you're earning twice as much in nominal terms. But notice, you still owe the same nominal amount. The mortgage balance decreases on schedule, but you're paying it back with cheaper dollars that have less purchasing power than the dollars you borrowed. In real terms, your debt burden has decreased. Inflation has worked in your favor. This is why debtors often benefit from inflation, especially unexpected inflation. They borrowed when dollars were more valuable. They repay when dollars are less valuable. The difference is a real transfer of wealth from the creditor to the debtor. Now flip the perspective. You're the bank that made that mortgage loan. You lent out 100,000 valuable dollars. Over the years, you get repaid in increasingly less valuable dollars. The interest you charged seemed adequate when the loan was made, but it didn't fully compensate for the inflation that followed. In real terms, you lost money on this loan. The purchasing power of the payments you receive is less than the purchasing power of the money you lent out. This is why creditors, lenders, bondholders, anyone expecting to receive fixed payments over time suffer from inflation. They're being repaid in degraded currency. The real return on their loan is less than the nominal return, potentially negative if inflation exceeds the interest rate. This dynamic shapes enormous political and economic conflicts. After wars, governments often have massive debts. Inflation allows them to repay those debts in cheaper currency, effectively defaulting partially without officially defaulting. This helps governments, but hurts bondholders. After World War II, many countries experienced inflation that eroded their war debts. This was arguably necessary. The debt burdens would have been crushing without inflation, but it still represented a transfer from savers and bondholders to government. The 1970s inflation in the United States benefited homeowners with fixed-rate mortgages tremendously. People who bought houses in the 60s or early 70s saw their mortgage payments become trivial relative to their rising incomes. While the value of their homes increased with inflation, they built wealth almost accidentally, simply by holding debt during an inflationary period. Meanwhile, people who had lent money, who held bonds, who had savings accounts earning low interest, saw their wealth erode. Let's think about retirees now, because this is one of the groups most vulnerable to inflation, and understanding their vulnerability helps illuminate inflation's human cost. Picture someone who retired in 1965 at age 65, after working for 40 years. They saved diligently, building up a nest egg of $50,000, a substantial sum at the time. They expected to live on the investment income and gradually draw down the principal. They calculated that this amount, combined with Social Security, would provide a comfortable retirement. Then came the inflation of the 70s. By 1980, 15 years later, inflation had eroded the purchasing power of that $50,000 by roughly 2/3. What could have bought a house in 1965 could barely buy a used car in 1980. The retiree, now 80 years old, found that the careful planning of a lifetime had been undone by macroeconomic forces beyond their control. If their income was fixed, a pension that paid a set dollar amount each month, or bonds that paid fixed interest, the erosion was even worse. The monthly check that covered expenses in 1965 was woefully inadequate in 1980. Food, housing, medical care, all had become much more expensive, but the income hadn't increased. This is why Social Security was indexed to inflation starting in the 1970s. Policymakers recognized that retirees on fixed incomes were being devastated. The cost of living adjustment, or COLA, means that Social Security benefits increase each year roughly in line with measured inflation. This doesn't make retirees whole. The CPI might not capture their actual inflation experience, especially for medical costs, but it prevents complete erosion of purchasing power. Pensions without inflation protection, however, have destroyed countless retirements. Someone receiving $2,000 per month from a pension might have felt secure when they retired. 20 years later, after sustained inflation, that $2,000 might not cover rent and basic expenses. They become impoverished not through any failure of their own, but through the invisible erosion of their fixed income. Contrast this with workers still employed, especially workers with bargaining power. When inflation accelerates, workers can demand raises. Their labour is repriced in the current market. If inflation is running at 5%, they can argue for at least a 5% raise to maintain purchasing power. Strong unions, skilled workers in high demand, professionals, they can often keep pace with inflation, at least roughly. But not all workers have this power. Those in weak labour market positions, those without unions, those whose wages are set by minimum wage laws that change infrequently, those in jobs that don't require specialised skills, they often see their wages lag inflation. Minimum wage in the United States, for example, has often gone years without adjustment even as inflation continued. Workers earning minimum wage saw their real income decline year after year, until Congress eventually raised the nominal minimum wage. This creates a divide. Workers who can demand raises might keep pace with inflation, or even gain slightly if their raises exceed inflation. Workers who cannot demand raises fall behind. The gap between skilled and unskilled, unionized and non-unionized, powerful and powerless, widens during inflationary periods. Let's consider business owners and entrepreneurs now, because their experience of inflation is complex and varies dramatically based on their specific situation. If you own a business that can easily raise prices, perhaps you provide a specialized service, or you're in an industry with little competition, inflation might barely affect you or might even help. Your costs rise, yes, but you raise your prices correspondingly. If you're carrying business debt at fixed rates, inflation helps you just as it helps homeowners with mortgages. Your profits, in nominal terms, might actually increase even if your real profits stay constant, and this nominal increase might feel like success. But if you're in a competitive industry where customers are price sensitive, inflation creates a terrible squeeze. Your costs, materials, labor, rent, utilities, all increase. But you can't raise prices because your customers will go to competitors. Or perhaps you can raise prices but only by less than your cost increases, so your profit margin shrinks. Small businesses, especially, often struggle in inflationary environments because they lack the market power to pass through all their cost increases. There's also the challenge of managing cash flow in inflation. Suppose you buy inventory today to sell over the next few months. If inflation is running at 1% per month, the goods you bought today will be more expensive to replace when you've sold them. You might calculate profit based on your original cost, thinking you're making money, only to discover that when you try to restock, the replacement cost is higher than your selling price. This is called inventory profit illusion, and it has bankrupted businesses that didn't account for it properly. Sophisticated businesses learn to adjust. They use LIFO accounting, last in, first out, which assumes you're selling your most recently purchased inventory first, giving a more realistic picture of current replacement costs. They raise prices proactively, anticipating inflation rather than reacting to it. They reduce inventory to minimize the capital tied up in goods that are losing value. But small businesses, run by people without accounting sophistication, often make mistakes that inflation punishes harshly. Now let's turn to a crucial distinction that inflation reveals sharply: the difference between holding cash and holding assets. Cash sitting in a checking account or stuffed under a mattress loses purchasing power during inflation. If you have $10,000 in cash and inflation runs at 5% for a year, you still have $10,000 nominally. But it can only buy what $9,500 could have bought a year ago. You've lost $500 of purchasing power. This loss is certain and automatic. The money just sits there dying slowly. Assets, on the other hand, often appreciate during inflation, at least in nominal terms. Real estate tends to increase in price as construction costs rise, and as inflation makes mortgage payments easier to manage, increasing demand. Stocks represent ownership in companies that can raise prices, so stock prices often rise with inflation, though imperfectly and with lots of volatility. Commodities, gold, oil, agricultural products, often rise in price during inflation because they're the real goods that inflated currency is chasing. This creates a fundamental divide between the asset-rich and the cash-poor. Wealthy people hold most of their wealth in assets: real estate, stocks, bonds, businesses, commodities. When inflation occurs, these assets often increase in nominal value, protecting or even increasing the holder's real wealth. Poor people, by contrast, hold most of their limited wealth in cash or cash equivalent forms. They don't own homes, they don't own stocks. They have savings accounts if they're fortunate, checking accounts, cash. All of these erode during inflation. The result is that inflation, especially unexpected inflation, tends to widen wealth inequality. The rich get relatively richer, protected by their asset holdings. The poor get relatively poorer, their meager cash savings losing value. The middle class experience depends on their specific situation. homeowners with mortgages often do reasonably well, while renters without assets suffer. Let's explore housing specifically, because it's such a crucial asset for most middle-class families, and because its relationship to inflation is so important. Imagine you bought a house in 2000 for $300,000 with a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. Your monthly payment is fixed at, let's say, $2,000. Over the next 20 years, moderate inflation continues, averaging 3% annually. By 2020, prices have increased by about 80%. Your salary, if it kept pace with inflation, has also increased by roughly 80%. That $2,000 mortgage payment that seemed substantial in 2000 now feels much more manageable because you're earning so much more in nominal terms. Meanwhile, the value of your house has increased. It's now worth perhaps $500,000 or more, not because it's a better house, but because construction costs have risen, because dollars are worth less, because new buyers are using inflated currency to bid on homes. You've built enormous wealth, almost passively. Your net worth, the value of the house minus the remaining mortgage, has increased substantially. Part of this is genuine real appreciation, but much of it is simply inflation pushing up nominal values. Either way, you benefit. Now contrast this with someone who rented during those same 20 years. They didn't benefit from the house price appreciation. Their rent probably increased roughly in line with inflation, so they didn't get the relief that the homeowner got from fixed mortgage payments. They built no equity. Inflation didn't help them at all and might have hurt them if their wages didn't keep perfectly pace. This dynamic is one reason why homeownership has traditionally been seen as a path to middle-class wealth in America. It's not just that houses appreciate in value, it's that buying with a fixed-rate mortgage creates a situation where inflation works in your favor. You fix a large chunk of your housing cost while your income rises with inflation. It's a form of forced saving and inflation protection combined. But notice what this means for inequality. Those who can afford to buy homes benefit from inflation. Those who cannot afford to buy homes don't. The gap between homeowners and renters widens during inflationary periods. And when house prices themselves are inflating rapidly, as they did in many cities in the 2010s and early 2020s, the gap becomes a chasm. People who already owned homes saw their wealth increase dramatically. People trying to buy their first home found it increasingly impossible. Let's think about international dimensions now, because inflation doesn't respect borders, and its effects ripple across the global economy in ways that can devastate entire countries. When a country experiences high inflation relative to other countries, its currency tends to depreciate in foreign exchange markets. This makes sense if you think about it. If dollars are losing purchasing power rapidly while euros are stable, people would rather hold euros than dollars. They sell dollars, buy euros, and the dollar falls in value relative to the euro. For developed countries with diversified economies, this depreciation can be manageable, even beneficial. It makes exports cheaper and more competitive. American goods become a bargain for European buyers. Tourism increases because visiting becomes cheaper for foreigners. The depreciation acts as a kind of automatic stabilizer. But for developing countries, especially those that import essential goods or have debts denominated in foreign currency depreciation from inflation can be catastrophic. If your country imports oil and food and your currency falls by 50%, those imports suddenly cost twice as much in local currency. This pushes inflation even higher. If your government or businesses owe debts in dollars and your local currency falls, those debts become unpayable. Countries spiral into crisis. Argentina has experienced this pattern repeatedly. High domestic inflation leads to currency depreciation. Depreciation makes imports expensive, fueling more inflation. People lose faith in the local currency and try to hold dollars instead, further weakening the local currency. The government tries to control this through currency controls, price controls, import restrictions, all of which create shortages and black markets without addressing the underlying problem of fiscal and monetary mismanagement. The cycle is vicious, and destructive. Turkey in the 2010s and early 2020s experienced a similar dynamic. President Erdogan kept pressure on the central bank to keep interest rates low despite high inflation, believing that low rates would stimulate growth. The lira collapsed in value. Inflation accelerated to over 80% annually by 2022. Ordinary Turks watched their savings evaporate, their salaries become worthless. Those who could convert money to dollars or euros did. Those who couldn't suffered terribly. The pattern reveals something important. Inflation hurts most those with the least power and least options. Wealthy people can move money to foreign currencies, can invest in assets that hold value, can move to other countries if necessary. Poor people are stuck. They hold local currency because they have no choice. They watch it lose value. They become poorer not through any failure of their own, but through economic forces beyond their control and often beyond their understanding. Let your mind rest with these inequalities for a moment. Inflation is not a natural disaster that strikes everyone equally like a flood or earthquake. It's an economic phenomenon that flows through existing channels of power and wealth, helping some and hurting others in predictable patterns. Understanding these patterns helps explain political reactions to inflation, helps explain why some groups demand action, while others might quietly benefit from inaction. There's one more group we should consider, those on the borderline of financial stability, those who are barely making it before inflation, and who fall into real hardship when it accelerates. Picture a family earning $50,000 per year. After taxes, housing, transportation, food, utilities, healthcare, and other necessities, they have very little margin. A few $100s per month in discretionary spending. A small emergency fund that would cover maybe 1 or 2 months of expenses if disaster struck. They're not poor exactly, but they're not secure either. They're one major expense away from financial crisis. Now inflation accelerates. Their rent increases by 10% when the lease renews. Gasoline prices rise. Grocery bills climb noticeably week by week. Healthcare costs continue their above-average inflation. Their employer gives them a 3% raise, which sounds good until you realize inflation is running at 7%. They're falling behind by 4%, which means they need to cut spending by about $2,000 per year just to maintain their previous financial position. Where do they cut? The emergency fund gets raided first. Then they delay necessary spending, the car repair that should be done, the dental work that can wait. They buy cheaper food, less healthy food. They cut out small luxuries that made life bearable, the occasional dinner out, the streaming services, the gifts for children's birthdays. They go into debt, putting expenses on credit cards because there's no other option. This is how inflation pushes people from marginal stability into real precarity. It's not dramatic. There's no single moment of crisis, just a slow erosion of the buffer that protected them from disaster, until one day the car breaks down and there's no money to fix it, or someone gets sick and there's no money for co-pays, and the cascade of consequences begins. These families often don't appear in discussions of who inflation hurts. The conversation focuses on the poor, who are already in crisis, or on retirees with fixed incomes, who are clearly vulnerable. But this middle group, working families who are managing but barely, they fall through the cracks of analysis while falling into the reality of hardship. Inflation, then, is deeply political precisely because it redistributes so much. It helps debtors, but hurts creditors. It can help homeowners, but hurts renters. It protects those with assets, but devastates those with only cash. It allows some workers to keep pace, but leaves others behind. It creates export opportunities for some businesses while crushing others in competitive markets. It can ease government debt burdens while destroying retirees' savings. There's no neutral position on inflation. Every choice about how aggressively to fight it, about what level to tolerate, about what tools to use, inevitably helps some groups and hurts others. This is why inflation policy is never just technical economics. It's always political economy, Always about power and distribution, always about winners and losers. Understanding this doesn't tell you what the right policy is. Reasonable people can disagree about the right balance, about whose interests should be prioritized, about what level of inflation is acceptable. But understanding that these trade-offs exist, that inflation is not simply a problem to solve, but a force that redistributes wealth and power, this understanding helps make sense of the fierce debates that inflation always generates. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. We've been through complex terrain, through the distribution of inflation's benefits and burdens, through the stories of debtors and creditors, homeowners and renters, the powerful and the powerless. Let it settle in your consciousness like layers of understanding, each one adding depth to your comprehension of this invisible force that shapes so many lives. Rest now. Breathe slowly. The redistribution continues whether we understand it or not. Whether it's fair or not, whether we approve or not. But now you see it more clearly. See who gains and who loses. See why the stakes are so high. That clarity is valuable. Carry it lightly. There's no urgency to do anything with this knowledge tonight. Just let it rest. Let yourself rest. Let sleep come if it will. You've learned enough. You understand enough. That's sufficient. Let peace follow understanding into sleep. We've seen how inflation redistributes wealth and power, helping some while hurting others, creating winners and losers through its invisible erosion of purchasing power. We've understood that inflation is never neutral, that it flows through existing channels of inequality, often widening gaps between those with assets and those without. Now let's turn to a more practical question, one that matters for anyone trying to navigate an inflationary world. How do central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve, try to control inflation? What tools do they use? How does the machinery of modern monetary policy actually work? Let yourself settle deeper into comfort. We're going to explore the inflation-fighting machine, the institutions and mechanisms that try to keep this invisible force under control. It's a story of power and limitation, of science and art, of success and failure. And understanding it helps demystify the economic news you hear, the interest rate announcements, the complex language that central bankers use. Let's begin with the Federal Reserve itself, because understanding the institution helps us understand why it acts as it does. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913 after a series of financial panics convinced policymakers that America needed a central bank. Previous attempts at central banking had failed or been dismantled due to political opposition and suspicion of concentrated financial power. But the panic of 1907, when the entire financial system nearly collapsed and was saved only by the intervention of private banker J.P. Morgan, made clear that leaving the financial system to self-regulate was too dangerous. The Fed, as it's commonly called, has a curious structure designed to balance different interests and reduce political control. It's technically independent within government, not a private institution, but not directly controlled by the President or Congress either. The Board of Governors is appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, but governors serve 14-year terms, much longer than any president's term, to insulate them from political pressure. The Fed has 12 regional banks located in cities across the country: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Richmond, Atlanta, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Dallas, and San Francisco. This regional structure was meant to prevent concentration of power in New York and to give different parts of the country a voice. The regional banks' presidents participate in monetary policy decisions, though voting rotates among them. This structure creates a kind of deliberate awkwardness, a system that can't move too quickly or too decisively, that requires consensus and deliberation. Whether this is wisdom or weakness depends on circumstances. In crisis, the Fed's slowness can be frustrating. In normal times, its independence and methodical approach provide stability. The Fed has what's called a dual mandate, assigned by Congress. It's supposed to pursue maximum employment and stable prices. Notice these two goals can conflict. Pushing for maximum employment might require stimulating the economy in ways that create inflation. Pursuing stable prices might require slowing the economy in ways that increase unemployment. The Fed must constantly balance these competing objectives, making trade-offs that are never perfect and always subject to criticism. For much of the Fed's history, it had multiple tools available, but one primary tool setting short-term interest rates. Let's understand how this tool works, because it's the main lever the Fed pulls to influence inflation. The federal funds rate is the interest rate banks charge each other for overnight loans. When one bank has excess reserves and another needs reserves to meet its requirements, they lend to each other at this rate. The Fed doesn't dictate this rate directly, but influences it through open market operations, buying and selling government securities. Here's how it works. If the Fed wants to lower interest rates, it buys government bonds from banks. The banks receive cash in exchange for bonds. Now they have more reserves, more cash sitting around. With more supply of loanable funds, the price of borrowing, the interest rate, falls. Banks are willing to lend to each other at lower rates because they have plenty of reserves. They're also willing to lend to businesses and consumers at lower rates. Lower interest rates stimulate the economy. Businesses find it cheaper to borrow for expansion. Consumers find it cheaper to buy houses with mortgages, cars with loans. Spending increases. Economic activity picks up. Unemployment tends to fall. But this stimulus can also create inflation if the economy is already running near capacity. Conversely, if the Fed wants to raise interest rates to fight inflation, it sells government bonds. Banks buy these bonds, paying with their reserves. Reserves decrease. Banks have less cash available to lend. The federal funds rate rises. All other interest rates tend to rise in sympathy. Borrowing becomes more expensive. Businesses delay expansions. Consumers delay major purchases. Spending decreases. Economic activity slows. Inflation pressure eases. But unemployment tends to rise. This is the fundamental trade-off. The balancing act the Fed must perform. Lower rates stimulate the economy but risk inflation. Higher rates control inflation but risk recession and unemployment. There's no perfect setting, no interest rate that achieves all goals simultaneously. The Fed must constantly adjust, trying to keep the economy in a narrow band of acceptable outcomes. Think of it like steering a large ship. The ship has tremendous momentum. When you turn the wheel, nothing happens immediately. The ship continues in its current direction. Only gradually, slowly, does the turn take effect. And by the time you see the effect, you might need to turn the wheel back the other direction. Overcorrect and you veer wildly. Undercorrect and you drift off course. The Fed is steering the economic ship with instruments that work with long lags, trying to navigate between the Scylla of inflation and the Charybdis of unemployment. The lag problem is crucial. When the Fed changes interest rates, the effect on the economy takes months to fully materialize. Lower rates today might not show up as increased borrowing and spending until 6 months from now, and might not show up as inflation for a year or more. Higher rates today might not slow the economy for months and might not reduce inflation for quarters or even years. The Fed must make decisions based on forecasts of where the economy will be, not where it is now. This creates the constant risk of mistakes. The Fed might raise rates to fight inflation that's already peaked on its own. The rate increases then push the economy into unnecessary recession. Or the Fed might keep rates low because inflation still seems modest, not realizing that inflation is building and will surge months later. By the time the surge appears, it's too late to prevent it, only to fight it after the fact. The Paul Volcker episode we discussed earlier illustrates both the power and the cost of interest rate policy. Volcker raised rates dramatically, accepting deep recession as the price of breaking inflation. It worked, but at enormous human cost. Could it have been done more gently? Perhaps, but perhaps not. The wage price spiral and embedded inflation expectations might have required exactly the shock treatment Volcker administered. We'll never know what would have happened with alternative approaches. Let your mind rest with this image of the Fed steering the economy through interest rate policy, making decisions with imperfect information and long lags, trying to balance competing objectives that can't all be achieved simultaneously. It's a harder job than it looks from the outside, though that doesn't excuse mistakes or shield the Fed from accountability. Now let's complicate the picture by discussing what happened when traditional interest rate policy reached its limits. In 2008, the financial crisis struck. Housing prices collapsed. Banks failed, or nearly failed. The economy fell into the worst recession since the Great Depression. The Fed, following standard practice, cut interest rates aggressively. The federal funds rate went from over 5% in 2007 to essentially zero by late 2008. Zero. The Fed had run out of room. Interest rates can't go much below zero. If they did, people would just hold cash instead of depositing it in banks. The Fed had used its primary tool to its maximum extent, but the economy was still in crisis. Unemployment was rising toward 10%. Deflation seemed possible. Traditional policy was exhausted, so the Fed invented new tools, or rather deployed tools that had been theoretical or used only in extremis. The most important was quantitative easing, usually shortened to QE. This sounds technical, but the concept is straightforward. The Fed created money electronically and used it to buy huge quantities of long-term government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. The goal was to lower long-term interest rates and to inject money directly into the financial system. Buying bonds pushes their prices up, which mathematically means their yields, the effective interest rates they pay, fall. Lower long-term rates should encourage borrowing and spending. The money injected through these purchases should increase bank reserves and lending capacity. The Fed bought trillions of dollars of securities through multiple rounds of QE between 2008 and 2014. The Fed's balance sheet, which had been under $1 trillion before the crisis, expanded to over $4 trillion. This was unprecedented. Critics warned it would create massive inflation. Money supply was expanding dramatically. Surely prices would surge. But the predicted inflation didn't materialize, at least not immediately. Throughout the 2010s, inflation remained low, often below the Fed's 2% target. Why? The answer reveals something important about how inflation actually works. Money supply is only one factor. What matters is whether money's being spent, whether it's circulating through the economy bidding up prices. Much of the money created through QE stayed in the financial system as bank reserves. Banks didn't lend it all out. Velocity of money, the rate at which money changes hands, fell. People and businesses, traumatized by the crisis, wanted to save rather than spend. The new money sat mostly idle. This defied simple monetarist theory, which held that increasing money supply mechanically increases prices. It turned out the relationship was more complex, mediated by behavior, psychology, financial system functioning. Money that doesn't circulate doesn't create inflation, no matter how much of it exists. The Fed also used forward guidance, clear communication about its intentions, as a policy tool. Fed Chair Ben Bernanke and later Janet Yellen would announce that rates would stay low for an extended period, that the Fed was committed to supporting the economy. This was meant to shape expectations, to encourage businesses and consumers to act as though low rates would persist, making them more willing to borrow and spend. Central banking was becoming psychological as much as mechanical. The Fed was trying to manage not just the money supply and interest rates, but expectations, confidence, the collective mood of millions of economic actors. Fed chairs gave speeches, held press conferences, testified to Congress, all trying to communicate clearly enough to guide behavior without creating panic or overconfidence. This brings us to the 2020s and the inflation surge that followed the COVID-19 pandemic. Here we can see the modern inflation-fighting machine in action, along with its limitations. In 2020, when the pandemic struck and economies shut down. The Fed and other central banks acted aggressively. Rates were cut to zero again. Trillions more in QE were deployed. Governments provided massive fiscal stimulus, direct payments to households, expanded unemployment benefits, business support. The goal was to prevent the pandemic recession from becoming a depression. The policies worked in preventing collapse, but they also created the conditions for inflation. Massive amounts of money were injected into the economy. Supply chains were disrupted, reducing available goods. When the economy reopened, demand surged while supply lagged. Too much money chasing too few goods, the classic demand-pull inflation scenario. At first, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell described the inflation as transitory, caused by temporary supply disruptions and base effects from the pandemic shutdown. He argued the Fed should look through this temporary inflation rather than overreacting. Raising rates prematurely might choke off the recovery, but the inflation persisted and accelerated. By 2021, it was clear this wasn't transitory. By 2022, inflation reached levels not seen since the early 1980s, peaking at over 9% in June 2022. The Fed had misdiagnosed the situation. Now it faced the unpleasant task of correcting course. Beginning in March 2022, the Fed began raising rates aggressively. The federal funds rate went from near zero to over 5% in just 18 months, one of the fastest tightening cycles in history. The Fed also began quantitative tightening, allowing bonds on its balance sheet to mature without replacement, slowly shrinking the balance sheet and removing money from the system. The effects rippled through the economy. Mortgage rates surged from around 3% to over 7%. Housing markets cooled dramatically. Stock prices fell. Tech companies that had thrived in the low-rate environment laid off workers. Banks that had invested in bonds found themselves holding assets that had lost value as rates rose. Several regional banks failed in early 2023, creating brief panic. Yet unemployment remained low, surprising many economists. The feared recession didn't immediately materialize. Inflation began to decline from its peak but remained above target. By late 2024 and into 2025, the Fed faced difficult questions. Was inflation defeated, or would it resurge if rates were lowered too soon? Could rates be lowered to support the economy without reigniting inflation? The answers were uncertain, and different economists offered different perspectives. This recent episode shows both the power and the limits of modern monetary policy. The Fed can influence inflation clearly. Rates affect borrowing, spending, economic activity, and ultimately prices. But the Fed can't control inflation precisely. The lags are long. The relationships are complex and changeable. Supply shocks, fiscal policy, global events, psychology, all these factors matter and are beyond the Fed's direct control. Let's talk about international coordination, because inflation doesn't respect borders, and central banks don't operate in isolation. When the Fed raises rates, the dollar tends to strengthen. Higher US rates attract foreign capital, seeking better returns. Demand for dollars increases. The dollar appreciates against other currencies. This helps the US by making imports cheaper, reducing inflation. But it hurts other countries, especially developing nations, by making their dollar-denominated debts more expensive and by making their exports less competitive. Other central banks must respond. If the Fed is raising rates and the European Central Bank or Bank of Japan keeps rates low, capital flows from Europe and Japan to the US, weakening the euro and yen. This imported inflation, through more expensive imports, can force other central banks to raise rates, even if their domestic economies don't warrant it. They're forced to follow the Fed to prevent destabilizing capital outflows and currency depreciation. This creates tension. Small countries especially feel they have little autonomy. If the Fed raises rates, they must follow or face currency crisis. Their monetary policy is effectively dictated by the Fed's decisions, which are made based on US conditions, not theirs. There have been attempts at international coordination. The Plaza Accord of 1985 saw major economies agree to coordinate currency policy. The G7 and G20 meetings include discussions of monetary policy coordination. But true coordination is rare. Each country prioritizes its own conditions. The Fed will not keep US rates low to help other countries if it believes higher rates are needed for US inflation control. This is one reason why international organizations like the International Monetary Fund exist, to help countries navigate these spillovers, to provide support when Fed policy creates problems elsewhere. But the fundamental asymmetry remains. The Fed is the most powerful central bank because the dollar is the global reserve currency. Its decisions shape global financial conditions in ways that other central banks' decisions do not. Let your thoughts drift through these mechanisms. The federal funds rate, open market operations, quantitative easing, forward guidance, international spillovers, these are the tools and channels through which modern central banks try to control inflation. They're imperfect tools, wielded by fallible humans, operating with lags and uncertainty. Sometimes they work well, sometimes they don't. Always they involve trade-offs. Understanding this machinery doesn't mean you need to have opinions about what the Fed should do. Reasonable people disagree, even expert economists who have spent careers studying these issues. But understanding the machinery means you can interpret the news better, can make sense of why the Fed does what it does, can see the constraints and challenges rather than imagining simple solutions that don't exist. The inflation-fighting machine is powerful but not omnipotent. It can influence inflation, but can't eliminate it entirely or control it perfectly. It must balance multiple objectives that often conflict. It operates with long lags, requiring decisions based on forecasts that are frequently wrong. The people operating it are intelligent and well-meaning but human, capable of mistakes and misjudgments. This is the reality of modern monetary policy. Not a perfect science, but an imperfect art. Practiced by institutions that evolve, learn from mistakes. Try to do better. The Fed of 2025 is very different from the Fed of 1913 or even of 1979. It has more tools, more sophistication, more transparency. But it still faces the same fundamental challenge, trying to steer an enormously complex economy towards stable prices and full employment, using tools that work indirectly, slowly, and imperfectly. If sleep is calling you now, answer it. We've explored complex machinery, traced the mechanisms of monetary policy, seen central banking's power and limitations. Let it all rest in your mind without strain. You don't need to remember every detail. Just the general understanding, the appreciation for complexity, the recognition that fighting inflation is hard and those who try deserve both accountability and empathy. Rest now. Breathe slowly. The Federal Reserve continues its work whether you're awake or asleep, adjusting rates by tiny increments, buying and selling bonds, managing expectations, trying to keep the economy stable. It's happening right now, quietly, in buildings in Washington and cities across America. The machinery hums along, and you can rest knowing that however imperfect, there are people and systems trying to keep the invisible force of inflation under control. Let that knowledge settle peacefully. Let yourself settle into sleep. Good night. We've explored the machinery of modern monetary policy, seen how central banks try to steer economies between the dangers of inflation and unemployment, using tools that work imperfectly and slowly. We've understood that fighting inflation is more art than science, requiring judgment and trade-offs rather than mechanical precision. Now let's turn to something more personal, more immediately practical. Let's talk about how ordinary people can protect themselves from inflation, how you can navigate an inflationary world without panic, with wisdom and calm preparation. Take a breath. Let yourself relax more deeply. We're going to move through practical strategies, but gently, without urgency, without the anxiety that often accompanies financial advice. This is about understanding options and principles, not about demanding action or creating fear. Let's begin with the most basic question. Where should you keep your money in an inflationary environment? The traditional answer for generations was a savings account at a bank. Put your money in, earn some interest, watch it grow slowly but safely. This made sense in low inflation environments where savings account interest rates exceeded inflation. Your money would actually gain purchasing power over time, modestly but reliably. But think about what happens when inflation exceeds the interest rate on your savings. Let's say your savings account pays 1% annual interest, but inflation is running at 4%. You deposit $10,000. A year later, you have $10,100 nominally. But prices have risen by 4%, so you need $10,400 to buy what your original $10,000 could have bought. You've lost $300 of purchasing power despite earning interest. Your money has died faster than it grew. This is the situation many people face in inflationary periods. Traditional savings accounts become guaranteed losers in real terms. The nominal balance increases, which feels like saving, but the real value decreases, which is the actual reality. This creates a painful dilemma. Keeping money in savings feels safe and responsible, but it guarantees erosion of purchasing power. So what are the alternatives? Let's explore them one by one, understanding the benefits and risks of each, seeing how different approaches might work for different situations and temperaments. First, there are Treasury Inflation-Protected Securities, usually called TIPS. These are bonds issued by the US government with a special feature. The principal adjusts with inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index. If you buy a TIPS bond for $10,000 and inflation runs at 3% over the next year, the principal adjusts to $10,300. You also receive interest, calculated as a percentage of the inflation-adjusted principal. TIPS provide direct protection against inflation. If inflation surges, your TIPS automatically adjust. If inflation runs at 10%, your principal increases by 10%. You can't lose purchasing power through inflation while holding TIPS. The government bears the inflation risk, and you receive the protection. This sounds perfect, but there are complications. TIPS tend to offer lower interest rates than regular Treasury bonds because of the inflation protection they provide. If inflation ends up being lower than expected, regular bonds might have provided better returns. TIPS are also more complex to understand, and the tax treatment can be awkward. You owe taxes on the inflation adjustment even though you haven't received it as cash, only as increased principal. But for people who are particularly worried about inflation, especially retirees who need to preserve purchasing power, TIPS can be valuable. They provide certainty that at least some portion of your wealth won't erode with inflation. That peace of mind might be worth accepting lower returns if inflation turns out to be modest. Let's think about stocks now, because stocks represent ownership in companies, and companies exist in the real economy producing goods and services. How do they perform during inflation? The theoretical answer is that stocks should provide reasonable inflation protection. Companies can raise prices when their costs rise. If inflation pushes up the cost of labor and materials, companies raise the prices they charge customers. Their revenues increase nominally. Their profits, in nominal terms, might stay stable or even grow. Stock prices, which ultimately reflect profits, should rise with inflation. The reality is more complicated. Some companies can raise prices easily. If you have a strong brand, if you provide a unique product or service, if you operate in an industry with little competition, you have pricing power. You can pass inflation through to customers without losing sales. These companies tend to do well during inflation. Their stock prices might even outpace inflation. But other companies struggle during inflation. If you operate in a competitive industry where customers are price sensitive, you can't raise prices without losing business. Your costs rise, but your revenues don't rise proportionally. Your profit margins shrink. Your stock price might fall even as general prices rise. These companies and their shareholders suffer during inflation. There's also the problem of interest rates. When the Fed raises rates to fight inflation, stock prices often fall, at least temporarily. Higher rates make bonds more attractive relative to stocks. They increase the discount rate used to value future profits, making those future profits worth less in present value. They slow the economy, potentially reducing company revenues and profits. The relationship between inflation, interest rates, and stock prices is complex and sometimes contradictory. Over very long periods, decades, stocks have historically outpaced inflation. A diversified portfolio of stocks has provided real returns that preserved and grew purchasing power. But over shorter periods, stocks can lose value in both nominal and real terms. The timing matters enormously. If you buy stocks at the peak before a recession and sell at the bottom, you lose badly regardless of long-term averages. This means stocks can be part of an inflation protection strategy, but they require tolerance for volatility and a long-term horizon. If you need money in the next few years, stocks are risky. If you're investing for decades, stocks historically have provided inflation protection plus real growth. But history doesn't guarantee the future, and the psychological difficulty of watching your portfolio lose value during market downturns can cause people to sell at exactly the wrong time, locking in losses. Real estate is another classic inflation hedge, and it's worth understanding why and how it works. We touched on this earlier when discussing homeownership and fixed-rate mortgages. If you own property and have financed it with fixed-rate debt, inflation works in your favour. Your mortgage payment is fixed in nominal terms. As your income rises with inflation, the payment becomes easier to manage. Meanwhile, property values often rise with inflation because construction costs increase, making existing properties more valuable. This has made homeownership a path to wealth for many Americans. You buy a house with a small down payment and a large fixed-rate mortgage. Over decades, inflation erodes the real value of your debt while increasing the nominal value of your asset. You build equity almost automatically. Not through any special insight, but simply by holding a leveraged real asset during an inflationary period. But real estate has complications too. Property taxes tend to rise with property values. Maintenance costs increase with general inflation. If you're buying investment property and renting it out, you face the challenge of whether you can raise rents enough to keep pace with your costs. Some locations have rent control or strong tenant protections that limit rent increases, capping your inflation protection. Real estate is also illiquid. You can't sell half your house if you need cash quickly. Transaction costs are high, agent commissions, closing costs, taxes, and real estate markets can be volatile. Housing prices don't just go up, they can crash, as many homeowners learned painfully in 2008 and 2009. Real estate provides inflation protection over long periods but offers no guarantees over short periods. There's also the question of whether real estate is accessible. Housing prices in many cities have risen so high that first-time buyers find homeownership impossible. If you already own, inflation might help you. If you're trying to buy, inflation in housing prices makes your goal recede further into the distance. The inflation hedge is available only to those who can afford entry, creating another dimension of inequality. Let's consider commodities now, the physical goods that underlie the economy: oil, gold, agricultural products, industrial metals. Commodities often rise in price during inflation almost by definition. Inflation is a general rise in prices, and commodities are a large component of what's being priced. When oil becomes more expensive, it pushes up the cost of everything that requires energy to produce or transport. When agricultural commodities rise, food prices rise. When industrial metals increase, manufacturing costs increase. Gold has traditionally been seen as an inflation hedge and a store of value. Unlike paper currency, gold can't be printed. Its supply grows slowly through mining. When confidence in currency falls, people often turn to gold as an alternative. During the 1970s inflation, Gold prices surged from $35 per ounce in 1971 to over $800 by 1980. People holding gold saw their purchasing power preserved, while those holding cash saw it erode. But gold also has limitations. It pays no interest or dividends. Its value comes entirely from price appreciation, from someone else being willing to pay more for it later. It can be volatile. Gold fell from its 1980 peak and didn't recover for decades. Storage and insurance cost money, and gold's value is partly psychological, dependent on collective belief in its worth, which can shift. Other commodities have similar characteristics. They tend to rise with inflation but are volatile and don't produce income. Investing in commodities usually means buying futures contracts or commodity-focused funds, which adds layers of complexity and cost. For most people, commodities might be a small part of a diversified portfolio, but shouldn't be the primary inflation protection strategy. Let's pause and think about what all this means for practical decision-making, because understanding options is only useful if it leads to clear thinking about choices. The fundamental insight is that different assets respond differently to inflation. Cash and fixed-rate bonds lose purchasing power. TIPS maintain purchasing power. Stocks have uncertain but potentially positive real returns. Real estate can provide protection, especially when leveraged with fixed-rate debt. Commodities often rise with inflation but are volatile. This suggests that diversification is wise. Don't put all your wealth in any single form. Hold some cash for liquidity and emergencies, accepting that it will erode slowly. Hold some stocks for long-term growth potential. Own your home if possible. With a fixed-rate mortgage, consider some tips for certainty of inflation protection. Maybe hold a small amount of commodities or gold as insurance against severe inflation. The right mix depends on your specific situation. How old are you? How much risk can you tolerate? How soon might you need the money? What's your income situation? There's no universal answer, only principles that must be adapted to individual circumstances. Let's talk about employment and wages, because for most people, labour income is far more important than investment returns. During inflationary periods, your ability to negotiate wage increases that match or exceed inflation becomes crucial. If your wages keep pace with inflation, you maintain your purchasing power regardless of what's happening to your savings. If your wages lag inflation, you become poorer in real terms no matter how wisely you invest your small savings. Workers with in-demand skills in growing industries with strong bargaining power, they tend to do well during inflation. They can change jobs for higher pay. They can negotiate raises that exceed inflation. They can maintain or even improve their standard of living. Workers in declining industries with common skills, with weak bargaining power, they struggle. Their wages stagnate in nominal terms or grow slower than inflation. They fall behind. This is part of why inflation creates political tension. The labour market determines who can keep pace and who falls behind, and those outcomes have little to do with moral worth or effort. If you're in a position to develop valuable skills, to make yourself more valuable to employers or clients, this might be the best inflation protection of all. No asset allocation can substitute for earning power. The ability to command higher wages that keep pace with or exceed inflation is worth more than any investment strategy. There's also the question of debt, which we've touched on before but is worth exploring more deeply. If you have fixed-rate debt, a mortgage, student loans, car loans, inflation helps you. You borrowed more valuable dollars, you repay with less valuable dollars. The real burden of the debt decreases. This is one reason why taking on reasonable amounts of fixed-rate debt to buy appreciating assets can be financially intelligent, especially in inflationary environments. But variable rate debt is different. If your debt adjusts with interest rates, and the Fed raises rates to fight inflation, your debt service costs increase. Credit card debt, which typically has variable rates, becomes more expensive during Fed tightening. This can create a painful squeeze, Inflation reduces your purchasing power while rising interest rates make your debt more expensive to service. The lesson is clear. Fixed-rate debt can be your friend during inflation. Variable-rate debt can be your enemy. Managing debt wisely means locking in fixed rates when possible and avoiding variable-rate debt, especially high-cost debt like credit cards. Let's think about Social Security and pensions, because these are crucial for retirees and future retirees. Social Security benefits adjust annually for inflation based on the CPI. This cost of living adjustment means that Social Security provides built-in inflation protection. If inflation is 3%, your benefit increases by roughly 3% the following year. This isn't perfect. The CPI might not match your personal inflation experience, but it's better than fixed payments that erode with inflation. Many private pensions, however, don't have inflation protection. You retire with a pension of, say, $3,000 per month. That's your benefit for life if inflation averages 3% annually. In 20 years, those $3,000 will have purchasing power equivalent to about $1,600 today. The pension that seemed adequate at retirement becomes inadequate as the years pass and inflation compounds. This is why financial advisors often recommend that retirees maintain some exposure to stocks or other growth assets rather than converting everything to fixed income. You need some assets that can grow nominally to offset the inflation that's eroding your fixed income sources. The challenge is balancing this need for growth against the reduced risk tolerance that typically comes with age and dependence on savings. Let's talk about psychology now, because how we think about inflation matters as much as the financial mechanics. Inflation creates anxiety partly because it involves loss of control. You can work hard, save diligently, make responsible choices, and still watch your purchasing power erode because of macroeconomic forces beyond your influence. This is frustrating and frightening. It violates the belief that personal virtue and effort determine outcomes. The temptation is to either panic or deny. Panic means making rash decisions, buying gold at peak prices, selling stocks at the bottom of a market crash, making leveraged bets that could pay off big or wipe you out. Denial means ignoring inflation, keeping everything in cash, refusing to adapt because you don't want to think about it. Neither extreme is wise. The better approach is informed acceptance. Inflation is happening. It will likely continue happening at varying rates for the foreseeable future. This is the environment. Accept it without panic. Understand your options. Make deliberate choices appropriate to your situation. Then let go of the anxiety and live your life. This psychological approach, calm awareness without obsession, is perhaps more important than any specific financial strategy. People who obsess over inflation, who constantly worry and trade and adjust, often do worse than people who set up reasonable diversification and then mostly ignore the day-to-day fluctuations. There's also something to be said for living well in the present rather than sacrificing everything to protect against uncertain future inflation. Yes, inflation might erode your savings, but you might not live to see it. Life has other risks besides inflation. Finding the balance between prudent preparation and present enjoyment is an art, not a science. Let your mind rest with these practical considerations. Tips, stocks, real estate, commodities, wage negotiation, debt management. Diversification, psychological balance. These are the tools and principles available to navigate inflation. None are perfect. All involve trade-offs. The right approach depends on your specific circumstances, which are unique to you. Understanding these options doesn't mean you need to act on all of them immediately or dramatically. It means you have a framework for thinking about inflation protection, a menu of possibilities you can consider as your situation, and priorities evolve. Small adjustments made calmly over time often work better than dramatic moves made in panic. If you're drifting towards sleep now, let yourself go. We've covered practical territory, explored strategies and tools. thought about how ordinary people can protect themselves from the invisible erosion of purchasing power. But these aren't urgent matters demanding immediate action. They're frameworks for thinking, principles to consider, options to be aware of. Rest now. Breathe slowly. Your money is dying every day, yes, but slowly enough that you can think clearly, plan wisely, act deliberately rather than desperately. The inflation you face is manageable with knowledge and patience. You don't need perfect protection, just reasonable preparation, and you have that now, or the foundation for it at least. Let that be sufficient. Let yourself be at peace with imperfect solutions to an imperfect world. Let sleep come if it will, carrying you away from financial anxiety into peaceful rest. We've explored practical strategies for protecting yourself from inflation, understanding that different assets respond differently to the slow erosion of purchasing power. That diversification and calm deliberation serve better than panic or denial. We've seen that there are no perfect solutions, only reasonable approaches adapted to individual circumstances. Now let's step back from the practical and turn to something more abstract, but equally important. The great debates about inflation that economists, policymakers and citizens continue to have. Because inflation is not just a technical problem with technical solutions. It's a question about how economies should work, about what governments should do, about competing values and visions. Take a slow breath. Let yourself settle even deeper. We're going to explore ideas and disagreements, theories and philosophies. This isn't about finding the right answer, because these debates don't have simple right answers. It's about understanding the landscape of thought, the different ways intelligent people think about inflation, and what to do about it. Let's begin with one of the most provocative recent schools of economic thought, modern monetary theory, often shortened to MMT. Modern monetary theory challenges many conventional assumptions about government debt, deficits, and inflation. The core insight, at least as MMT proponents present it, is that countries that issue their own currency and borrow in that currency can never involuntarily default on debt. They can always create money to pay obligations denominated in their own currency. The United States can always pay debts denominated in dollars. Japan can always pay debts denominated in yen. This seems obvious, but has radical implications. If default isn't a real risk, then what limits government spending? The MMT answer is inflation. The constraint on government spending isn't how much it can borrow, but how much real resources, labour, materials, productive capacity the economy has available. As long as there's unemployed labour and unused capacity, government can spend more without causing inflation. Government spending puts idle resources to work. Only when the economy reaches full employment, when all resources are being used, does additional government spending create inflation by bidding up prices for scarce resources. This inverts the usual thinking. Conventional wisdom says government should balance budgets. The deficits are generally bad except in emergencies. MMT says government deficits are normal and necessary, that the government must run deficits for the private sector to accumulate savings. Conventional wisdom worries about debt levels. MMT says debt levels don't matter as long as inflation is under control. The implications are significant. If MMT is right, governments have been too timid. They could have spent much more on infrastructure, education, healthcare, research, job programs. The limiting factor wasn't money but political will and understanding. Unemployment wasn't necessary, it was a choice, made out of misguided fear of deficits. Critics of MMT argue it's dangerously wrong. They point out that while government can always print money to pay debts, doing so can destroy the currency's value through inflation or hyperinflation. Yes, the US can always print dollars to pay dollar-denominated debt, but if it prints recklessly, the dollar becomes worthless. The constraint is real even if default in a technical sense isn't possible. Critics also argue MMT underestimates the difficulty of controlling inflation once it starts. MMT suggests that if government spending causes inflation, just raise taxes to remove money from the economy. But raising taxes is politically difficult. In practice, governments find it easy to spend and hard to tax, especially to raise taxes quickly in response to inflation. This asymmetry means MMT-inspired policies could lead to inflation spirals that are hard to stop. The debate between MMT and conventional economics is partly about facts. Does the economy work as MMT describes, but also about values and risk tolerance? MMT proponents are willing to risk some inflation to achieve full employment and public investment. Conventional economists are more inflation-averse, willing to accept some unemployment to keep inflation low. Neither position is purely right or wrong. They represent different priorities and different assessments of risk. Let your mind sit with this tension. Full employment or price stability, public investment or fiscal restraint. Different visions of what matters most, what risks are acceptable, what kind of economy we want. Now let's turn to a more recent debate, one that played out in real time and affected millions of lives. The transitory versus persistent inflation debate of 2021 through 2023. In early 2021, as the economy reopened from COVID shutdowns, inflation began to rise. Prices that had been stable or even falling during the pandemic suddenly jumped. Used cars became much more expensive. Gasoline prices rose. Lumber prices spiked. Across many categories, price increases became noticeable. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell and many economists described this inflation as transitory. The argument was that pandemic disruptions had created temporary supply chain problems and unusual demand patterns. People were buying goods instead of services because services like restaurants and travel were still limited. Semiconductor shortages affected car production. Shipping container shortages drove up freight costs. These were temporary problems that would resolve as the economy normalized. Once supply chains healed and demand patterns returned to normal, inflation would subside. The Fed should look through this temporary spike rather than raising interest rates prematurely and choking off the recovery. This analysis seemed reasonable. Many of the price increases did seem tied to specific, temporary disruptions, and the memory of the slow recovery from the 2008 financial crisis made policymakers cautious about tightening too soon. Better to risk some inflation than to cause another lost decade of high unemployment. But the inflation didn't prove transitory. It persisted through 2021 and accelerated in 2022. By mid-2022, inflation reached over 9% annually, the highest in 4 decades. The _18_ characterization looked increasingly wrong. Critics argued the Fed had misdiagnosed the situation, had kept policy too loose for too long, had allowed inflation to become embedded in expectations. Why did the Fed get it wrong? Partly bad luck. Supply chain problems proved more persistent than expected, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine created new energy and food price shocks, but also perhaps overconfidence in models and underestimation of how much fiscal stimulus had been injected into the economy. Trillions of dollars in pandemic relief, direct payments, expanded unemployment, business support had flooded the economy with money. Combined with supply constraints, this created classic demand pull inflation. The consequence was that the Fed had to tighten aggressively, raising rates faster than it would have if it had started earlier. This aggressive tightening risked recession. The Fed was trying to thread a needle, raise rates enough to control inflation but not so much as to crash the economy. Whether this would succeed remained uncertain as of 2025, but the episode revealed the difficulty of real-time economic diagnosis and policy making. The transitory debate also revealed deeper questions. When should central banks act preemptively versus wait for clearer data? How much weight should be given to models versus real-world price signals? How do you balance the risks of acting too soon versus too late? These questions have no algorithmic answers. They require judgment, and judgment can be wrong. Let's consider another fundamental question. Should central banks target inflation at all, or is some other goal more appropriate? For the past several decades, inflation targeting has been the dominant framework. Central banks announce an explicit inflation target, typically 2% annually, and adjust policy to achieve it. This provides clarity and anchors expectations. People know what the central bank is trying to do. This predictability itself helps stabilize inflation, but some economists question whether inflation targeting is the right approach. Should central banks instead target nominal GDP growth, or the price level, or employment? Directly, each alternative has advantages and disadvantages. Nominal GDP targeting would focus on the total dollar value of all goods and services produced. If nominal GDP growth is steady at, say, 4 or 5% annually, some combination of real growth and inflation is happening. This might be more flexible than pure inflation targeting, allowing higher inflation when growth is weak and lower inflation when growth is strong. Price level targeting would focus not on the inflation rate, but on the absolute price level. If inflation overshoots the target one year, the central bank would aim for below target inflation the next year to get the price level back on track. This provides more certainty about long-term price stability, but might create more volatility in the short term. Employment targeting would prioritize jobs over prices, accepting higher inflation if necessary to keep unemployment low. This was somewhat the approach in the 1960s and 70s, and it contributed to the Great Inflation, which is why it fell out of favour. But some argue it's a more humane priority. Unemployment destroys lives more directly than moderate inflation does. Each framework embodies values and priorities. Inflation targeting prioritizes price stability, which helps creditors, savers, people on fixed incomes. Employment targeting prioritizes work and wages, which helps workers, debtors, people who need jobs. There's no purely technical way to choose between them. It's a question of what kind of economy we want, who we want to protect, what risks we're willing to accept. Let's think about the costs of fighting inflation versus living with it, because this trade-off is central to many policy debates. Fighting inflation, especially when it's become embedded, requires inducing recession. The Volcker recession of the early 1980s showed this starkly. Unemployment above 10%, businesses failing, families losing homes, communities devastated. The human cost was enormous, even if the long-term benefit of breaking inflation was also significant. Was it worth it? Those who suffered might reasonably say no. Those who benefited from the subsequent decades of low inflation might say yes. But there's no objective way to compare the suffering of those who lost jobs in 1982 against the benefits to those who experienced stable prices in the 1990s and 2000s. Different people were affected, and we can't make interpersonal comparisons of suffering and benefit with any precision. Some economists argue we should be more tolerant of inflation, accepting higher rates, perhaps 4 or 5%, rather than insisting on 2%. The cost of keeping inflation at 2% in terms of foregone employment and growth might exceed the cost of living with 4% inflation. If everyone's wages and benefits were indexed to inflation, if social security and pensions adjusted automatically, if contracts accounted for it, moderate inflation might be manageable. We'd all adjust and the real economy would function fine. The counter-argument is that inflation, once tolerated, tends to accelerate. 4% becomes 5% becomes 7%. Inflation expectations become unanchored. People start behaving in ways that make inflation worse, demanding preemptive wage increases, raising prices preemptively, shifting to real assets and foreign currency. The economy becomes less efficient as price signals become noisier. What starts as tolerable inflation becomes intolerable inflation, requiring painful correction anyway. This is an empirical question without a clear answer. We know that very low inflation and very high inflation are both problematic. The sweet spot is somewhere in between. But exactly where? 2%? 3%? 4%? Economists disagree based on different readings of evidence and different priorities. Let your thoughts drift through these debates without needing to resolve them. They're not meant to be resolved tonight, or perhaps ever. They're meant to be wrestled with, considered from multiple angles, held in tension. Let's turn to distributional questions, because inflation policy inevitably creates winners and losers, and who wins and who loses is a political choice as much as an economic one. When central banks raise rates to fight inflation, the burden falls most heavily on workers who lose jobs in the resulting slowdown. These are often the most vulnerable workers, last hired, first fired. The benefits accrue to those who hold financial assets that maintain value, who have savings that don't erode, who live on fixed incomes that don't decline in real terms. Roughly speaking, fighting inflation aggressively helps creditors and the wealthy at the expense of debtors and workers. Conversely, tolerating inflation helps debtors and workers at the expense of creditors and savers. Those with fixed-rate debt see it eroded. Those who can demand wage increases keep pace. But those on fixed incomes, those with savings, those who can't command wage increases suffer. There's no neutral policy. Every choice about how aggressively to fight inflation, about what target to pursue, about what tools to use, redistributes well-being from some groups to others. Acknowledging this makes inflation policy unavoidably political. It's not just technocrats optimizing based on neutral criteria. It's people making choices about who should bear costs and who should receive benefits. In democratic societies, these choices should arguably be made democratically. But central bank independence, the Fed's insulation from political pressure, removes some of these choices from democratic accountability. The Fed can impose recession, can accept high unemployment, can make choices that hurt millions of people. Without facing voters, this independence is justified as protecting long-term stability from short-term political pressure. But it also means that enormously consequential distributional choices are made by unelected technocrats. There's no easy resolution to this tension. Too much political control over monetary policy leads to inflationary bias. Politicians facing elections want low unemployment now and will tolerate inflation. But too little democratic accountability means profound choices about who suffers and who benefits are made without public input. Different countries balance this differently, and the right balance might shift over time. Now let's consider future challenges, the forces that might shape inflation in the decades ahead. Climate change presents both inflationary and deflationary pressures. The transition to renewable energy requires massive investment, new infrastructure, new technologies, stranded assets in fossil fuels. This investment could be inflationary if it competes for scarce resources. Extreme weather events disrupt supply chains and agricultural production, creating cost-push inflation. On the other hand, technological improvement in renewable energy and batteries could be deflationary, making energy cheaper over time. Demographics in developed countries trend toward aging populations. Older people consume more healthcare, which has persistent inflation above general price levels. But older people also spend less overall, which could be deflationary. Shrinking working-age populations could create labour scarcity and wage inflation, or could reduce consumption and create deflation. The net effect is uncertain. Deglobalization, if it continues, likely creates inflation. The decades of falling goods prices as manufacturing shifted to low-cost countries like China might reverse if production moves back to higher-cost locations. Supply chain resilience might be prioritized over cost minimization, increasing prices. Trade barriers and geopolitical tensions could fragment markets, reducing efficiency and raising costs. Technological change cuts both ways. Artificial intelligence and automation could dramatically increase productivity, creating deflationary pressure as goods and services become cheaper to produce. Or it could create disruption and displacement that reduces spending and demand. The distribution of AI's benefits matters. If they accrue mainly to capital owners while workers are displaced, consumption could fall and deflation could result. If benefits are widely shared, productivity gains could raise living standards without inflation. Government debt levels are high in many developed countries and rising. At some point, might governments be tempted to inflate away debt, rather than raising taxes or cutting spending? This would be a choice to create inflation deliberately as a form of default that doesn't look like default. It's happened before historically. Whether it happens in coming decades depends on political choices we haven't made yet. All these forces interact in complex ways. The future of inflation isn't predetermined. It depends on technological developments, political choices, international relations, climate outcomes, variables that are themselves uncertain. Anyone who claims to know what inflation will be in 10 or 20 years is overconfident. We can identify forces and trends, but their interaction and relative strength will determine outcomes we can't precisely predict. Let yourself rest in this uncertainty. The future is genuinely unknown. The debates about inflation policy continue because reasonable people examining the same evidence reach different conclusions based on different frameworks, different priorities, different experiences. This isn't a weakness. It's the nature of complex social questions that don't have objectively correct answers. Understanding these debates doesn't mean you need to take sides definitively. It means you can see why inflation policy is contentious, why smart economists disagree, why politicians struggle with these issues. The disagreement isn't usually from stupidity or bad faith. It's from genuinely different perspectives on genuinely difficult questions. If sleep is pulling you under now, let it take you. We've explored contested intellectual territory, seen how economists and policymakers debate the fundamental questions of how to think about and respond to inflation. These debates will continue long after you wake. They were happening before you were born and will continue after we're all gone. Inflation is an old problem without final solutions, only provisional approaches that work better or worse under changing circumstances. Rest now. Breathe slowly. The great debates continue whether you're awake or asleep, in seminar rooms and central bank meetings and congressional hearings. Smart people wrestle with hard questions, trying to steer economies toward better outcomes, knowing they'll be criticized regardless of what they choose, knowing their understanding is incomplete. It's humbling work, requiring both confidence to act and humility to acknowledge uncertainty. You don't have to solve these problems tonight. You don't have to choose sides in every debate. Just understand that the questions are hard, the trade-offs real, the answers uncertain. That understanding itself is valuable, a guard against both false certainty and cynical dismissal. Hold it lightly. Let it inform without burdening. And let yourself drift now into sleep, into peace, into rest from the complexity of economic policy and the weight of difficult questions. Good night. We've explored the great debates about inflation, seen how economists and policymakers wrestle with fundamental questions that have no perfect answers, only trade-offs and competing priorities. We've understood that reasonable people disagree not from ignorance but from different values and different assessments of uncertain futures. Now let's turn to something more intimate, more human. Let's explore the personal stories of people who've lived through inflation, who felt its effects not as statistics or theories, but as lived reality, as daily struggle and adaptation, as reshaping of hopes and plans. Take a slow breath. Let yourself sink deeper into rest. We're going to meet some people across different times and places, seeing inflation through their eyes, feeling what it meant to them. These stories will help us understand that inflation isn't just numbers on charts. It's disruption of lives, forcing of choices, testing of resilience. Let's begin in the 1970s, in a small town in the American Midwest, with a family we'll call the Johnsons. Tom Johnson worked at the local factory, making decent wages. His wife Mary stayed home with their 3 children, as was common then. In 1973 their life was comfortable, not wealthy but secure. They owned a modest house with a fixed-rate mortgage. They had a car, though not a new one. The children had what they needed. There was enough for occasional treats, a weekend trip, dinner at a restaurant, small gifts. Then came the oil embargo and the acceleration of inflation. Gasoline prices doubled, then doubled again. Tom's commute to the factory suddenly cost much more. The grocery bills began climbing noticeably. Mary, who had always managed the household budget carefully, found that the same money bought less each week. She started switching to cheaper brands, cheaper cuts of meat, eventually less meat altogether. The children learned to expect less, to not ask for things that had previously been routine. Tom's wages did increase, but always lagging behind prices. The union negotiated raises, but by the time they took effect, inflation had already eroded their value. He was running to stay in place, working just as hard but falling behind. The sense of progress, of building toward a better future, evaporated. They were just surviving, treading water. The fixed mortgage payment, though, became their saving grace, as inflation pushed up prices and wages nominally. The $800 monthly payment that had seemed substantial in 1970 became much more manageable by 1978. This was inflation working in their favour, the one piece of good fortune in an otherwise difficult period. They didn't understand it in economic terms, they just knew the house payment felt lighter, while everything else felt heavier. By the early 1980s, when Volcker's medicine broke inflation, Tom lost his job in the recession. The factory cut production, laid off workers. For 18 months he was unemployed, living on unemployment benefits and Mary's part-time work. They burned through their small savings. They fell behind on bills. The children went without. It was the hardest period of their lives. But inflation broke. When Tom finally found new work, prices were stable. Over the next decade, their real wages grew. They could save again, plan again, feel like they were making progress. The children went to college. The Johnsons could take vacations. They rebuilt. The trauma of the 70s and early 80s faded but never disappeared entirely. They never quite trusted prosperity again, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Let that story settle. Feel the weight of watching your budget stretched month after month, of working hard but falling behind, of the relief of finally returning to stability. The Johnson story was repeated in millions of households, each with its own details but the same underlying pattern of struggle and adaptation. Now let's travel to Argentina in the 1980s and 90s, to a much more severe inflation crisis, to see what happens when inflation becomes not an inconvenience but a catastrophe. Maria lived in Buenos Aires. She was a teacher, middle class, educated. In the early 1980s, inflation in Argentina began accelerating from uncomfortable to unbearable. By the late 80s, it reached thousands of % annually. By 1989 and 1990, it exploded into hyperinflation. Maria's salary was paid monthly, but by the time she received it, much of its value had evaporated. She learned to spend money immediately upon receiving it. On payday, she would rush to stores to buy whatever non-perishable goods she could. Canned food, rice, flour, soap, anything that would hold value better than the rapidly depreciating pesos. She wasn't hoarding out of greed. She was protecting herself from theft by inflation. Prices changed daily, sometimes multiple times per day. Shop owners would put up new prices in the morning, then again in the afternoon. Going to the grocery store required bringing enormous stacks of bills. Maria remembers needing a bag to carry the cash for a week's groceries. The bills themselves weren't worth the paper they were printed on. People converted to US dollars whenever possible. Those with dollars were protected. Those stuck with pesos watched their savings, their salaries, their entire financial lives dissolve like sugar in water. Maria had a small amount of savings from years of teaching. Within months of hyperinflation, those savings became worthless, insufficient to buy a single meal. A lifetime of careful saving gone. The psychological toll was immense. You couldn't plan. You couldn't save. The basic architecture of financial life collapsed. How do you buy a house when money loses half its value in weeks? How do you save for your children's education? How do you plan retirement? You can't. You can only survive day to day, hand to mouth, converting wages to goods or dollars as quickly as possible. Maria's teaching became almost voluntary. The real value of her salary fell so low that it barely covered transportation to work. She taught because she believed in education, because she had always been a teacher, because giving up felt like surrendering to chaos. But economically it made little sense. Many of her colleagues quit to drive taxis or sell things on the street. Or at least they could conduct transactions in dollars or barter. The social fabric frayed. Trust evaporated. Everyone was scrambling to protect themselves. The sense of shared society, of being in it together, weakened. It was every person for themselves. Trying to survive economic warfare where the enemy was invisible but the casualties were everywhere. Argentina eventually stabilized by pegging the peso to the dollar in 1991 and implementing strict monetary discipline. Hyperinflation stopped. Prices became predictable again. People could plan beyond the next day. Maria could save again, though she never trusted the peso completely. She kept dollars hidden at home, just in case. The trauma of hyperinflation marked an entire generation. Even decades later, Argentines remained wary, quick to convert to dollars at any sign of instability. Let Maria's story rest in your mind. Imagine the daily scramble, the constant calculation, the exhaustion of living in an economy that's coming apart. Hyperinflation isn't just inflation that's faster. It's a qualitatively different experience, a kind of economic violence that destroys not just wealth, but the basic structures of planning and trust that make complex societies possible. Now let's come to more recent times, to the inflation of 2022 and 2023 in the United States, and meet a young couple trying to buy their first home. Sarah and David had been saving for years. They both worked, she as a nurse, he in tech. They lived modestly, putting away money carefully, building toward a down payment on a house. By early 2022, they had saved $50,000. In the city where they lived, this would be enough for a 20% down payment on a starter home in a decent neighborhood. They were ready. Then housing prices surged. The combination of low interest rates, pandemic-driven demand for more space, and supply chain problems reducing new construction pushed prices up dramatically. Houses that had been listed at $250,000 in 2020 were now $350,000 or $400,000. Their $50,000 down payment was suddenly insufficient. They'd need $70,000 or $80,000. They kept saving, but it felt hopeless. Each month they saved $2,000. But each month, housing prices rose faster. They were running on a treadmill that was accelerating. The goal receded further into the distance the harder they pursued it. The American dream of home ownership, which their parents had achieved easily in their 20s, seemed impossible. Then mortgage rates began rising as the Fed fought inflation. Rates that had been 3% rose to 5%, then 6%, then 7%. Even if they could afford the down payment, the monthly payment at higher rates was crushing. A house that would have cost them $1,500 per month at 3% would cost $2,300 at 7%. Their income hadn't increased nearly enough to compensate. They felt betrayed, though they couldn't articulate by whom or what exactly. They had done everything right. They'd gotten education, worked hard, saved diligently, lived within their means. But forces beyond their control, monetary policy, inflation, market dynamics, had moved the goalposts. What had been achievable when they started saving was now out of reach. Sarah cried sometimes, overwhelmed by the injustice of it. David grew cynical, wondering if home ownership was just for previous generations or for the already wealthy. They argued about whether to keep saving or give up, whether to move to a cheaper city where they had no connections, whether to take on more risk by buying, with a smaller down payment and higher monthly costs than they were comfortable with. They represented millions of young people experiencing inflation not as an abstract economic phenomenon, but as a barrier to life milestones they'd assumed would be accessible. The inflation was moderate by historical standards, nothing like the 70s, nothing remotely like hyperinflation. But it still reshaped lives, still frustrated plans, still created genuine suffering even if that suffering looked trivial compared to what others had endured. By late 2024, they were still renting, still saving, still hoping. Housing prices had stabilised somewhat. Interest rates had come down slightly, maybe in another year or two, maybe. They tried to maintain hope while adjusting to the reality that their path would be harder than they'd imagined, that the timeline had stretched, that their assumptions about adulthood had been wrong. Hold their frustration gently. Feel the weight of doing everything right, but finding the reward moved out of reach by forces beyond your control. This is inflation's human face in the 21st century. Not hyperinflation destroying currency, not 1970s stagflation, but still real hardship, still genuine impact on real lives. Let's visit another story, one of adaptation rather than defeat. Meet James, a small business owner during the same 2022 inflation surge. James owned a small cafe in a college town. He'd started it 10 years earlier, built a loyal customer base, employed a dozen people. It was never going to make him rich, but it provided decent living and satisfaction. He loved the community his cafe created, the regular customers, the rhythms of the day. When inflation hit, his costs exploded. Coffee beans, milk, flour, sugar, everything he bought became more expensive. His rent increased. Utilities rose. Most significantly, labour costs increased as workers demanded higher wages to keep pace with their own rising costs of living. He wanted to pay his workers fairly. They were the heart of his business. But the raises they needed pushed his costs up dramatically. He faced the agonising decision of raising prices. His customers were mostly students and local residents, not wealthy people. They came to his cafe partly because it was affordable, a place where you could spend a couple hours with a coffee and pastry without breaking the bank. If he raised prices too much, he'd lose them, but if he didn't raise prices, his margins would disappear. He'd be losing money on every cup of coffee sold. The business would fail. He'd have to close, laying off his employees, losing the enterprise he'd built, leaving a void in the community. He raised prices gradually, reluctantly, apologetically. A coffee that had been $2.50 became $3, then $3.50. Pastries that had been $4 became $5, then $5.50. Each increase hurt. He put up a sign explaining that costs had risen, that he was trying to keep the cafe viable while paying workers fairly. Some customers understood and stayed loyal. Others grumbled and came less often. A few stopped coming entirely. James worked longer hours to reduce labour costs. He negotiated harder with suppliers. He eliminated some menu items that had become too expensive to make profitably. He found cheaper alternatives where he could without sacrificing quality too much. He adapted constantly, making dozens of small adjustments to survive in the new environment. The cafe survived. It's still operating in 2025, still employing people, still serving the community. But it's a more anxious, precarious existence than before. James's margins are thinner. He has less buffer for unexpected costs. He worries more. The easy confidence of the pre-inflation years has given way to constant vigilance. His story is one of resilience and adaptation, but also of the hidden costs of inflation. Even when businesses survive, even when they adapt, there's a toll. The stress, the anxiety, the hours spent managing what used to be manageable, the relationships strained by necessary price increases. These costs don't show up in economic statistics, but are real nonetheless. Let's meet one more person. Helen, a retiree living on a fixed pension. Helen had worked as an administrator for a mid-sized company for 35 years. She retired in 2015 at age 65, with a pension that paid her $2,800 per month, plus Social Security of about $1,500. Total income of $4,300 monthly. It seemed adequate. Her house was paid off. Her needs were modest. She could live comfortably, travel occasionally, help her grandchildren a bit. The first few years were fine. Inflation was low, around 2% annually. Her Social Security adjusted for inflation, maintaining its purchasing power. The pension didn't adjust, but the erosion was slow enough that she barely noticed. She was managing fine. Then came the 2022 inflation surge. Her cost began rising noticeably. Groceries, gasoline, utilities, insurance, medical expenses, everything more expensive. Her Social Security increased by about 6% in 2023 to match inflation, which helped. But her pension remained fixed at $2,800 monthly. That income, which had seemed adequate in 2015, was now worth significantly less in purchasing power. She started making small adjustments, generic brands instead of name brands, less meat, fewer trips to visit the grandchildren because gasoline was expensive, postponing home repairs, turning the thermostat down in winter to save on heating. None of these changes were catastrophic individually, but collectively they represented a downward slide, a gradual constriction of her life. She felt invisible. The news talked about inflation's impact on workers, on families trying to buy homes, on businesses struggling with costs. But retirees on fixed pensions were rarely mentioned. She and others like her were suffering quietly, making do, not complaining because complaining felt undignified at her age. But the suffering was real. She had to dip into her savings, which she had hoped to leave to her children and grandchildren. She had saved carefully throughout her working life, built up a nest egg of about $120,000 in retirement accounts. She had planned to draw down only the investment returns, preserving the principal. But now she was spending principal to maintain a modest lifestyle, watching the balance decline, knowing that at some point it would run out. She wasn't facing homelessness or hunger. Compared to many, she was fortunate. But she was experiencing downward mobility in retirement, becoming poorer in real terms year by year despite having done everything right. She had worked hard, saved diligently, planned carefully. The pension that had seemed secure was failing her not because the company defaulted, but because inflation eroded it while she was defenseless to earn more. Her story repeats in millions of lives. Retirees who can't earn additional income, who depend on fixed pensions that didn't anticipate sustained inflation, watching their purchasing power decline, making the small, sad adjustments that add up to diminish life. Let these stories settle in your consciousness. Tom and Mary Johnson in the 70s, struggling but surviving. Maria in Argentina, living through hyperinflation's chaos. Sarah and David trying to buy a home as prices surge. James adapting his cafe to survive higher costs. Helen watching her fixed pension erode in retirement. Different times, different places, different specific circumstances, but the same underlying reality. Inflation disrupts plans, forces choices, redistributes well-being in ways that often feel arbitrary and unjust. These are not just economic stories, they're human stories. They're about dignity and struggle, about resilience and frustration, about adaptation and loss. The statistics we've discussed throughout our conversation, inflation rates, interest rates, price indices, these are abstractions that represent millions of individual experiences like these. Understanding inflation through stories helps us remember what the numbers mean. When we hear that inflation is 5%, we should think of Sarah and David watching homeownership slip away. When we hear about the Fed raising rates, we should think of James struggling to price his menu. When we discuss fixed versus indexed incomes, we should think of Helen watching her pension's purchasing power decline. This doesn't tell us what policy should be. Different people's stories point in different directions. Tom and Mary needed inflation to break, even though it meant Tom lost his job. Maria needed hyperinflation to stop, regardless of the adjustment costs. Sarah and David might benefit from policies that lower housing prices, but those same policies might hurt others. Helen needs inflation to stop or her pension to be indexed, but inflation fighting hurts workers. There's no policy that helps everyone. Every choice creates winners and losers. Acknowledging this, seeing the human faces behind the numbers, makes us more thoughtful about the trade-offs, more humble about the limits of policy, more compassionate toward those who suffer regardless of what's chosen. If sleep is calling you now, let yourself drift. We've travelled through personal stories, felt the weight of inflation on real lives, seen how the invisible erosion of purchasing power translates into postponed dreams, difficult choices, gradual decline. These stories are happening now all around us, in our own communities and cities and countries. You carry these stories now, these glimpses into other lives shaped by inflation. Let them rest gently in your memory. Let them inform your understanding without burdening you. Economic forces are impersonal, but their effects are deeply personal. Remembering this makes us more human in how we think about policy and politics, more empathetic in how we relate to others' struggles. Rest now. Breathe slowly. The stories continue, being lived and written every day by ordinary people navigating extraordinary pressures. You've listened. You've understood. That's enough. Let compassion follow understanding into sleep, carrying you toward peace and rest. Good night. We've travelled through personal stories, felt inflation's impact on real lives across different times and places, seen how this invisible force shapes individual destinies in ways both small and profound. We've understood that behind every statistic are millions of human beings making difficult choices, adapting to circumstances beyond their control, carrying on with dignity despite hardship. Now, as we approach the end of our journey together, let's step back one final time and reflect on what all of this means, what we can take away from this long meditation on money and its slow death. Let yourself sink completely into rest now. There's no new information to absorb, no complex ideas to wrestle with, just reflection, integration, gentle closing. We've been on this journey for hours. You've learned much. Now let it all settle. Let the pieces arrange themselves into understanding that serves you. Let's begin by returning to where we started, the simple observation that your money is dying every day. We opened with a cup of coffee, with the recognition that $1 today cannot do what $1 could do years ago. We've explored why this happens, traced inflation through centuries, examined its causes and consequences, met the people who try to control it and the people who live with it. And through all of this, one truth has remained constant. The purchasing power of money erodes over time. This is not aberration. This is the normal state of modern economies. Understanding this changes how we think about financial decisions. Keeping large amounts of cash feels safe because the nominal amount doesn't change. But we now know that safety is illusory. The number stays the same while the value falls. Real safety comes from assets that can maintain purchasing power. Real estate, stocks, inflation-protected securities, human capital in the form of valuable skills. Cash has its place for liquidity in emergencies, but it's a depreciating asset that must be managed carefully. This perspective can be liberating. It suggests that some of the best inflation hedges aren't financial at all. Investing in your education and skills, which can't be inflated away. Building relationships and community, which provide non-monetary forms of security and richness. Taking care of your health, which reduces future costs and preserves your ability to work and enjoy life. Living experiences rather than just accumulating money, because experiences have value that doesn't erode with inflation. This isn't to say money doesn't matter, it clearly does. But money serves life. Life doesn't serve money. Keeping this priority straight helps maintain perspective during inflationary times. Yes, adjust your financial strategies, But don't let inflation anxiety consume you. Don't let fear of losing purchasing power prevent you from living. Let's reflect on the political and social dimensions we've explored, because inflation is never just economics. We've seen how inflation redistributes wealth and power, helping some while hurting others. We've understood that there's no neutral inflation policy, that every choice involves trade-offs between competing goods, price stability versus full employment, creditor interests versus debtor interests, different groups' well-being. This makes inflation inherently political. Understanding this should make us more thoughtful citizens. When politicians propose policies, when central banks make decisions, when economists debate, we can ask, who benefits and who is burdened? What values are being prioritized? What risks are being taken and on whose behalf? These questions don't have obvious answers, but asking them is important. Let's reflect on uncertainty and control, themes that have run through our entire exploration. One of inflation's most difficult aspects is the loss of control it represents. You can work hard, save carefully, make responsible choices, and still watch your purchasing power erode because of macroeconomic forces completely beyond your influence. The Federal Reserve's decisions, Congress's fiscal policy, global supply chains, pandemic disruptions, wars on other continents, all these factors shape inflation, and none are within your control. This can create anxiety and helplessness, but it can also, paradoxically, create a kind of freedom. If you accept that you can't control inflation, you can focus on what you can control: your skills and employability, your spending choices, your asset allocation, your career decisions, your level of debt and type of debt. These are within your influence, and managing them well provides genuine protection even if imperfect. There's also acceptance to be found in recognizing that life always involves uncertainty and factors beyond our control. Inflation is one such factor, but hardly the only one. Health, relationships, accidents, opportunities. All of these involve uncertainty. The attempt to achieve perfect security through perfect financial planning is futile. Some level of vulnerability is inherent in being human and living in a complex society. We've travelled through personal stories, felt inflation's impact on real lives across different times and places, seen how this invisible force shapes individual destinies in ways both small and profound. We've understood that behind every statistic are millions of human beings making difficult choices, adapting to circumstances beyond their control, carrying on with dignity despite hardship. Now, as we approach the end of our journey together, let's step back one final time and reflect on what all of this means, what we can take away from this long meditation on money and its slow death. Let yourself sink completely into rest now. There's no new information to absorb, no complex ideas to wrestle with, just reflection, integration, gentle closing. We've been on this journey for hours. You've learned much. Now let it all settle. Let the pieces arrange themselves into understanding that serves you. Let's begin by returning to where we started. The simple observation that your money is dying every day. We opened with a cup of coffee, with the recognition that $1 today cannot do what $1 could do years ago. We've explored why this happens, traced inflation through centuries, examined its causes and consequences, met the people who try to control it and the people who live with it. And through all of this, one truth has remained constant. The purchasing power of money erodes over time. This is not aberration. This is the normal state of modern economies. Understanding this changes how we think about financial decisions. Keeping large amounts of cash feels safe because the nominal amount doesn't change. But we now know that safety is illusory. The number stays the same while the value falls. Real safety comes from assets that can maintain purchasing power: real estate, stocks, inflation-protected securities, human capital in the form of valuable skills. Cash has its place for liquidity in emergencies, but it's a depreciating asset that must be managed carefully. This understanding also brings a kind of peace. When you see prices rising and feel anxious, you can recognize what's happening. You're not imagining it. It's not that you're bad with money. It's that the money itself is changing, losing value in ways that are systematic and predictable. Your experience is valid, your frustration is justified, and your adaptation, seeking raises, investing wisely, making careful choices, these are appropriate responses to real forces. Let's think about what inflation teaches us about value itself, because this might be the deepest lesson of all. Money is not value. Money represents value, facilitates exchange of value, provides a measuring stick for value. But money itself, especially fiat currency not backed by gold or anything physical, is just shared belief. It works because we collectively agree it works. A dollar has value because everyone accepts it as having value. If that collective belief wavers, the dollar's value wavers. Inflation is, in a sense, a slow erosion of collective confidence, a gradual adjustment of how much value we assign to each unit of currency. Real value lies in other things, in productive capacity, factories, farms, technology, knowledge, in human relationships and community bonds, in health and time and experience, in the skills that allow you to create value for others. These forms of value are more fundamental than money. Money is just a tool for exchanging them. Inflation reminds us not to confuse the tool with the thing itself. Accumulating dollars is not the same as accumulating value. If the dollars are losing purchasing power faster than they're accumulating, you're actually becoming poorer despite growing account balances. Real wealth is measured in what you can do, what you can have, what life you can live, not in nominal dollar amounts. This perspective can be liberating. It suggests that some of the best inflation hedges aren't financial at all. Investing in your education and skills, which can't be inflated away. Building relationships and community, which provide non-monetary forms of security and richness. Taking care of your health, which reduces future costs and preserves your ability to work and enjoy life. Living experiences rather than just accumulating money, because experiences have value that doesn't erode with inflation. This isn't to say money doesn't matter, it clearly does, but money serves life. Life doesn't serve money. Keeping this priority straight helps maintain perspective during inflationary times. Yes, adjust your financial strategies, but don't let inflation anxiety consume you. Don't let fear of losing purchasing power prevent you from living. Let's reflect on the political and social dimensions we've explored, because inflation is never just economics. We've seen how inflation redistributes wealth and power, helping some while hurting others. We've understood that there's no neutral inflation policy, that every choice involves trade-offs between competing goods, price stability versus full employment, creditor interests versus debtor interests, different groups' well-being. This makes inflation inherently political. Understanding this should make us more thoughtful citizens. When politicians propose policies, when central banks make decisions, when economists debate, we can ask, who benefits and who is burdened? What values are being prioritized? What risks are being taken, and on whose behalf? These questions don't have obvious answers, but asking them is important. It should also make us more empathetic. When we see people struggling with rising costs, we can recognize they're not necessarily making bad choices. They might be on the wrong side of inflation's redistribution through no fault of their own. When we hear calls for different policies, we can understand that different groups have different interests based on their economic positions. The retiree on a fixed pension has different needs than the worker seeking a raise, than the homeowner with a mortgage, than the saver with a bank account. All of these perspectives are legitimate. The challenge is finding policies that balance them fairly. This empathy extends internationally. We've seen how inflation in wealthy countries creates spillover effects in poorer countries. American monetary policy, designed for American conditions, shapes financial conditions globally. This creates responsibilities that aren't always acknowledged. understanding this interdependence should make us more conscious of how our prosperity connects to and affects others around the world. Let's think about time and perspective, because inflation plays out over years and decades, and our experience of it depends greatly on our time horizon. For someone young starting their career, moderate inflation might be manageable or even beneficial. They have decades to earn, to invest in appreciating assets, to benefit from wage growth that hopefully outpaces prices. Fixed-rate debt taken on early in life gets eroded by inflation over the years. Real estate purchased young appreciates nominally, while the mortgage payment becomes lighter relative to income. The long-time horizon allows inflation to work for them in certain ways. For someone approaching retirement, the calculation changes. Time is limited. The ability to earn additional income is ending. Assets accumulated must now be drawn down to live on. Inflation that erodes purchasing power over the remaining decades of life is genuinely threatening. The fixed pension that seemed adequate becomes inadequate. The savings that looked sufficient prove insufficient as prices rise faster than investment returns. This means there's no universal answer to quote 19. It depends on who you are, where you are in life, what your economic position is. This relativity makes public discussion difficult because people are genuinely experiencing different realities. The young person who sees homeownership slipping away experiences inflation differently than the person who bought 20 years ago and is watching their home value and equity grow. Both experiences are valid. Both perspectives are real. Understanding this can make us slower to judge. More careful about assuming our experience is universal. The inflation that's devastating you might be helping your neighbour. The policy that would help you might hurt someone else. This doesn't mean we shouldn't advocate for our interests. It means we should do so with humility, recognizing the legitimacy of competing interests. Let's reflect on uncertainty and control, themes that have run through our entire exploration. One of inflation's most difficult aspects is the loss of control it represents. You can work hard, save carefully, make responsible choices, and still watch your purchasing power erode because of macroeconomic forces completely beyond your influence. The Federal Reserve's decisions, Congress's fiscal policy, global supply chains, pandemic disruptions, wars on other continents, all these factors shape inflation, and none are within your control. This can create anxiety and helplessness, but it can also, paradoxically, create a kind of freedom. If you accept that you can't control inflation, you can focus on what you can control: your skills and employability, your spending choices, your asset allocation, your career decisions, your level of debt and type of debt. These are within your influence, and managing them well provides genuine protection even if imperfect. There's also acceptance to be found in recognizing that life always involves uncertainty and factors beyond our control. Inflation is one such factor, but hardly the only one. Health, relationships, accidents, opportunities, all of these involve uncertainty. The attempt to achieve perfect security through perfect financial planning is futile. Some level of vulnerability is inherent in being human and living in a complex society. This doesn't mean giving up or being reckless. It means doing what you reasonably can while accepting that outcomes aren't entirely within your control. This acceptance can reduce anxiety. You prepare as well as you can, then let go of the obsessive worry that changes nothing and just makes you miserable. Let's think about the long arc of economic history and what it suggests about inflation's future. For most of human history, prices were fairly stable across generations. The medieval peasant's grandfather and grandson faced similar prices for bread and tools. This stability came from technological stagnation, from economies that didn't grow much, from money tied to precious metals with limited supply growth. The modern era of persistent inflation began roughly in the mid-20th century, with the abandonment of gold standards and the rise of fiat currency managed by central banks. This shift was deliberate, meant to give governments flexibility to manage economies, to prevent depressions, to allow growth without the constraint of limited gold supplies. The cost was persistent inflation. This regime has lasted about 75 years. That seems like a long time from our perspective, but it's actually rather short in historical terms. It's not obvious this regime will last forever. Changes could come from technological shifts. Perhaps digital currencies change monetary dynamics,